Hey there, welcome to True Crime Records. Tonight, we're stepping into the dark heart of New York's underworld, into the story of a man whose violence didn't happen in alleyways or backstreets, but behind locked doors, in quiet industrial rooms, hidden in plain sight. Roy DeMeo to the outside world. He looked ordinary, a Brooklyn family man, a small-time entrepreneur, a familiar face in neighborhood bars. But hidden beneath that everyday life was one of the most brutal killing machines ever. Connected to the American Mafia, they didn't call him a lone wolf. They didn't call him reckless. They called him efficient. Roy DeMeo didn't just kill. He built a system for killing a group so cold, so organized, and so untraceable that some believe they executed more silent murders than any crew in modern mob history. And for years, no one could stop them. Tonight, we'll walk slowly through his rise, his crew, the quiet disappearances, the fear that spread through the New York underworld, and the violent and that finally exposed what had been hiding behind closed doors. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Our late-night true crime family stretches across the world. Now settle in, let the noise of the day fade, and follow me into the controlled, calculated world of a man whose name still whispers through mafia history. This is True Crime Records, and if you're new here, make sure to subscribe. There's a new story waiting for you every night. Chapter 1: Brooklyn Before the Darkness. Before the city ever learned to fear his name, before rumors whispered through the back rooms of bars and along the quiet edges of abandoned warehouses, there was only a neighborhood. Ordinary streets, brick apartment buildings, children playing stickball under fading streetlights, laundry swaying between windows in the slow summer air. This was Brooklyn in the years after the Second World War, crowded, noisy, alive with motion and ambition. A place where families lived close together, where reputation was currency, and where survival often meant learning the rules long before anyone explained them to you. It was here that Roy DeMeo came into the world. The people who knew him early on, Roy didn't look like a future legend of violence. He looked like many other boys in the neighborhood, sharp-eyed, restless, and eager to prove himself in a world that rewarded toughness. He grew up surrounded by voices that spoke of loyalty and respect, of how quickly weakness was noticed, and how slowly humiliation was forgotten. There were lessons everywhere, some spoken, many silently observed. Brooklyn didn't raise children gently in those years. It hardened them through routine, through watching how men carried themselves on street corners, through seeing who people stepped aside for and who people ignored. Power was never explained. It was demonstrated. Roy learned early that attention mattered. Being invisible meant being vulnerable. Being remembered meant being protected. And so, from a young age, he practiced being noticed, not through charm, not through jokes, but through presence. That he stood longer than others, looked harder, spoke with a quiet confidence that made people unsure how seriously to take him. There was something coiled beneath the surface, not rage exactly, but intensity. And intensity, in that world, could become opportunity. As he grew older, the streets began to open doors that school never could. He drifted toward people who understood the hidden economy of Brooklyn, the one that lived beneath ordinary businesses. Backroom deals, borrowed money, quiet favors traded for future protection. It didn't feel criminal at first. It felt like network, a way of surviving without being small. Roy apprenticed himself to influence rather than to skill. He watched how certain men spoke softly and were still obeyed, how money moved without records, how danger could be present without being visible. And more importantly, he watched who disappeared. In his neighborhood, disappearances were never announced. People simply stopped asking about certain names. A store changed ownership overnight. A landlord sold quicker than expected. Someone who always sat at the same bar stool suddenly made room for someone else. This taught Roy a powerful lesson. Erasure was possible, not through public punishment, but through quiet replacement. As a young man, he moved quickly into the lower layers of organized crime. Small collections, small thefts, running errands that were never written down, delivering messages without questions, being useful without appearing ambitious. He understood something instinctively that many never learn. Visibility invites danger. Utility invites protection. The more reliable he became, the more trust gathered around him. And trust, in that world, was more valuable than feared. By his early 20s, Roy was no longer just another neighborhood kid. He was becoming a connector, someone who moved between people, passing along information, opportunities, and occasionally warnings. This made him valuable to men higher up the ladder, and it put him directly in the gravitational pull of something much larger, the Gambino crime family. At first, their presence was felt only indirectly, a name that people lowered their voices around, a force that explained outcomes without ever appearing in person. To Roy, the idea of belonging to something that powerful was intoxicating, not because of money, because of permission, permission to operate without apology, permission to intimidate without fear of consequence, permission to become someone others adjusted their lives around. And so, he stepped closer. He began aligning himself with figures attached to the Gambino family, men who had already crossed the invisible threshold between ordinary crime and organized power. Through them, Roy learned how systems truly worked. That violence was not random, that rules existed even in chaos, that every action carried expectation, and every expectation carried cost. Most importantly, he learned that those who could solve problems permanently rose faster than those who merely created them. This was the seed, not of anger, not of madness, but of efficiency, and efficiency, in time, would become his signature. At home, Roy maintained the image of a working family man. He married. He had children. He built a life that looked respectable from the outside, a necessary disguise in a world where visibility meant surveillance. Neighbors saw him as reliable, hardworking, quiet. They didn't see the apprenticeship unfolding beneath the surface. They didn't see how he was learning to remove obstacles without leaving marks, how he observed emotion not to share it, but to exploit it, how he practiced speaking calmly even when pressure mounted. Where other men used volume to establish dominance, Roy learned to use certainty. He didn't threaten loudly. He implied outcomes softly. By the time he was fully embedded within the Gambino structure, he was no longer learning the rules. He was beginning to redefine how they could be enforced. But the most dangerous years were still ahead, because Roy DeMeo had not yet learned how much damage he was capable of, and the city had not yet learned how quietly a system of death could be built behind closed doors. Brooklyn in the late 1960s and early 70s was a place of contrasts. Half the borough was changing, new families, new cultures, new ambitions filling the streets, while the other half clung tightly to the old rules, the unspoken codes that had guided generations of men who knew that what couldn't be built through politics could be taken through power. In that half, respect didn't come from offices or uniforms. It came from how people moved aside when you entered a room. Roy DeMeo was learning how to make people move. At first, he kept things small. He handled collections for local loan sharks, tracking down debtors who had fallen behind. He didn't have the bulk or reputation yet to scare people, so he relied on patience and pressure, visiting repeatedly, asking calmly, reminding them that money always found its way home. When calm didn't work, he made sure others came with him, men who could stand silently behind his words, amplifying their weight. It was during these years that Roy began to understand how loyalty was manufactured. It wasn't built on fear, not at first. It was built on reliability. If you showed up when others wouldn't, people remembered. If you followed through when others hesitated, people talked. And in the world of organized crime, talk was currency. Roy's name began to circulate quietly. He wasn't flashy, but he got things done. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, and more importantly, he didn't lose his temper. That calmness, that unnerving composure, drew attention from higher up the food chain. One of those who noticed was a rising figure within the Gambino crime family, a man known for his own discipline and ruthlessness, Nino Gaggi. Gaggi was the kind of mentor who didn't waste time with small talk. He believed in action, in teaching through risk. To him, Roy represented something rare, a young man who understood the mathematics of crime. Roy kept ledgers. He tracked debts. He calculated interest rates with precision. While most collectors lived day to day, Roy treated his work like an enterprise. That impressed Nino Gaggi, and even Tooley, it made Roy indispensable. Gaggi began feeding Roy more serious responsibilities: smuggling operations, auto theft networks, money laundering through used car lots, and small businesses. It was the kind of work that built wealth quietly, layer by layer, while also keeping the attention of law enforcement diverted elsewhere. Roy thrived in that environment. He liked structure, that he liked rules that he could manipulate. But success came with new demands. Loyalty upward meant pressure downward. And soon Roy realized that in the criminal world, debts weren't the only things that had to be collected. Sometimes it was silence. Sometimes it was obedience. Sometimes it was life itself. At first, the line between business and brutality made him uneasy. That he wasn't born a killer, he was, however, born adaptable. The first time Gaggy sent him to handle a problem. Personally, Roy prepared the way he always did, methodically, clinically. He observed the target, noted routines, studied weaknesses. When the time came, he didn't let emotion interfere. He acted with precision, like he was crossing an item off a list. When it was done, he didn't celebrate. He didn't panic. He just noted the outcome, adjusted the process, and learned. That was the moment Roy DeMeo began to change. Killing, to him, was not chaos. It was logistics, and logistics were something he understood better than anyone. From there, the assignments grew darker. Every success tightened his relationship with Gaggy, and by extension, with the Gambino hierarchy. He was now part of a machine, one that relied on secrecy and fear to operate smoothly. Roy knew that to survive in it, he had to build his own system, one that didn't depend on approval from above or favors from equals. So he started building what would later become the DeMeo Crew. It began modestly. A few trusted friends from the neighborhood, men who shared his appetite for power and his aversion to attention. They operated out of auto shops and small warehouses in Brooklyn, hiding crime behind the noise of ordinary labor. Their early work was simple: repossessions, stolen cars, debt enforcement. But Roy had bigger plans. He realized that every illegal business, no matter how lucrative, eventually faced the same obstacle: loose ends, unreliable partners, witnesses, debtors who talked too much. To control chaos, you had to eliminate evidence. And to eliminate evidence, you had to learn how to make people disappear. Roy developed an obsession with efficiency. Every detail mattered, not just how the job was done, but how it was erased. He became the architect of disappearance, creating procedures that were as cold as they were effective. He didn't talk about it openly. He didn't need to. Those who worked with him learned quickly. Mistakes were not repeated, because those who made them did not return. Yet despite the growing shadows around him, Roy maintained his double life seamlessly. At home, he was still the picture of suburban normality: a husband, a father, a man who grilled on weekends and paid his bills on time. His neighbors saw a proud family man who worked hard and dressed well. They never noticed the way his eyes lingered a second too long when someone mentioned betrayal or gossip. They didn't see the quiet calculation always running behind his calm expression. What made Roy DeMeo so dangerous wasn't his brutality. It was his ability to separate it from emotion. He didn't rage. He didn't threaten. That he decided. That quiet certainty became his reputation. Men in the underworld started to speak about him differently. Not as a hothead, but as a professional. Someone who didn't talk, didn't flinch, and didn't fail. And in the hierarchy of organized crime, that made him invaluable. Still, Gaggy watched him carefully. Ambition was dangerous. For every man who climbed too fast, there was a reckoning waiting above. But for the moment, Roy's efficiency worked to everyone's advantage. That he was earning money, enforcing discipline, and creating results that could not be traced back to the family. What no one realized, not yet, was that Roy's need for control was evolving into something else entirely. The same precision that made him a reliable earner was also feeding a darker impulse, one that would soon reshape the meaning of loyalty, power, and silence inside the Gambino empire. And in the quiet spaces between his legitimate life and his secret one, Roy DeMeo was about to design a system of fear so complete, it would make him both indispensable and untouchable. By the early 1970s, Roy DeMeo was no longer just a reliable earner. He was becoming something else entirely: a quiet architect of systems, a man who thought not just about individual jobs, but about structures that could operate without him standing over them. That was the difference between a soldier and a strategist. Roy wanted permanence. His connection to the Gambino crime family gave him protection, but it also gave him expectations. Money had to flow upward. Problems had to disappear downward. Between those two forces, Roy built his crew. The DeMeo Crew didn't begin as a fearsome unit. At the start, it looked like every other street-level outfit in Brooklyn. A handful of men with loose loyalty, overlapping schemes, and shifting ambitions. What made Roy different was his insistence on loyalty before profit. He didn't recruit men who just wanted fast money. He recruited men who needed him. Some needed protection, some needed opportunity, some needed redemption from past mistakes. Roy offered all three in exchange for obedience. The men who gathered around him began to notice something unusual. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't intimidate with theatrics that he listened. He observed. And when he spoke, it was decisive. There was no confusion about where you stood with Roy DeMeo. You were either useful or you were a liability. That principle became the soul of his operation. At first, the crew focused on what Roy knew best: auto theft and resale. Stolen cars from New York were shipped across state lines, stripped down, reassembled, and sold with clean paperwork. It was efficient, quiet, and incredibly profitable. Each success strengthened Roy's reputation as a problem solver who didn't attract headlines. Soon came drug distribution, handled carefully through intermediaries so the crew never stood too close to the product. Roy believed distance protected longevity. If law enforcement ever closed in, he wanted layers of separation between himself and the evidence. Then came the work no one liked to talk about: enforcement. The crew became known not just for what they stole, but for what they erased: debtors who vanished, partners who broke deals and were never heard from again, men who spoke too freely and suddenly fell silent. No bodies, no witnesses, no explanations. Fear traveled faster than facts. By the middle of the decade, Roy was running one of the most disciplined operations tied to the Gambino network. Other captains respected his efficiency but kept their distance. Roy didn't socialize much. He didn't drink heavily. He didn't gossip. He treated crime the way a banker treated investments: numbers, leverage, and risk management. Yet all the while, his double life remained flawless. At home, Roy was the dependable provider. A man who worked hard, paid his taxes, attended family events, and kept his household orderly. He blended into suburban life so well that even those closest to him would later struggle to match the domestic man with the underworld figure. This ability to compartmentalize was his greatest weapon. Roy did not see contradiction in his life that to him. There were simply two sets of rules. Point one set governed the kitchen table, school schedules, and backyard conversations. The other governed debt, loyalty, and silence, and the two never overlapped. But power demands proof. As Roy's influence grew, so did the expectations from above. The Gambino hierarchy wanted reassurance that he could not only earn, but control. And control in the underworld was measured not in promises, but in outcomes. The orders became more sensitive. The problems became more permanent. Roy began refining methods that ensured no questions followed his solutions. Everything was calculated: timing, location, disposal. Each job reinforced his reputation as a man who did not leave loose ends. Word spread quietly through Brooklyn that if Roy DeMeo was handling something, you would never hear about it again. That silence became terrifying currency. Some men feared him, some admired him, many depended on him. And dependence is the purest form of power. By the end of the 1970s, the DeMeo crew had become something more than a street operation. It was a machine, integrated into larger criminal networks while remaining fiercely independent in how it enforced order. Roy had done what few men ever accomplished. He made himself indispensable. But that kind of importance never lasts forever. The same systems that protect a man also draw attention. The same efficiency that earns trust also breeds suspicion. Above Roy, powerful eyes were watching. Below him, loyal men were growing restless. And around him, law enforcement was beginning to notice patterns that no organization as quiet as it should have left behind. Roy DeMeo had built a kingdom without a crown. That he had created fear without chaos. He had mastered silence without isolation. But every system, no matter how perfect, eventually produces pressure, and that pressure was rising. Chapter 2: The Money Machine Awakens. By the time the 1970s settled into their deeper, darker years, Roy DeMeo had built something rare in the criminal world: not just a crew, but a self-feeding machine. Money no longer came in bursts or streaks of luck. It arrived steadily, predictably, like a tide that never receded. And in the underworld, stability was the most dangerous kind of power. The foundation of that money machine rested on three pillars: cars, credit, and control. Auto theft remained the heart of the operation. Stolen vehicles flowed out of neighborhoods across Brooklyn and nearby boroughs, disappearing into chop shops, shipping yards, and resale pipelines that stretched well beyond New York. The brilliance of Roy's system wasn't that cars were stolen. Everyone did that. It was that his crew owned the entire life cycle: the theft, the stripping, the reassembly, the documentation, and the final sale. Nothing leaked outward. Each man in the pipeline knew only his small task. The thief never met the buyer. The buyer never met the shipper. The shipper never met Roy. Roy believed in distance the way generals believe in terrain. Distance kept him untouchable. With the car operation stabilized, Roy expanded aggressively into credit fraud, loan sharking, and underground finance. These weren't glamorous rackets, but they were relentless. Money was lent fast, interest climbed faster, and debt trapped people in cycles they couldn't escape. Unlike visible crimes, debt was invisible. Victims didn't run to police. They ran to Roy for extensions, forgiveness, breathing room, which he offered at a cost. The business side of Roy DeMeo was so refined that even some in the Gambino crime family began to view him less as an enforcer and more as an executive. He didn't just collect, he managed. He kept detailed mental records of who owed what, who could be pushed, and who was nearing collapse. And collapse, in Roy's world, was not a financial event. It was a permanent one. As the money flowed upward, so did expectations. The higher ranks wanted reliability. They wanted problems solved quietly. They wanted witnesses erased without headlines. Roy delivered. The DeMeo crew transformed from a neighborhood operation into a service unit of silence. If a man needed to disappear without publicity, Roy was who they called. If a deal had soured too badly for negotiation, Roy was who handled the ending. And the more often he succeeded, the more the demand grew. Success made him invaluable. Invaluable made him dangerous. Within his own circle, Roy ruled without spectacle. He didn't posture as a king. He operated like a manager who expected perfect results. Meetings were brief. Instructions were precise. Disobedience wasn't shouted down. It was quietly removed. The men under him learned a terrifying lesson. Roy did not threaten consequences. He simply engineered them. As the profits multiplied, so did the violence, but always in Roy's controlled, unemotional style. There were no public warnings, no dramatic statements. The absence of a man became the statement. And absence travels fast in criminal circles. What frightened outsiders most was not the brutality itself. It was the efficiency. When men vanished around Roy, the operations continued without interruption. Money still moved. Deals were still honored. It was as if the missing person had never existed at all. That illusion of seamless continuity gave Roy an aura of inevitability. Cross him, and life simply adjusted without you in it. Yet for all this darkness, Roy still returned home each night to suburban normalcy. He ate dinner with his family. He discussed school schedules. He paid bills and maintained appearances. The man running one of the most terrifying underground systems in New York also worried about lawn maintenance and grocery prices. This duality fed his sense of invincibility. Law enforcement, meanwhile, was still several steps behind. They knew cars were vanishing. They knew debts were being enforced beyond the legal limit. They knew disappearances clustered around certain names. But nothing connected cleanly. No witnesses survived long enough to testify. No physical evidence surfaced in usable form. Roy had achieved a rare thing: profit without exposure. But every machine that runs perfectly draws attention. Not from failure, but from envy. Other crews resented his growth. Rival factions whispered about how he moved too freely. Even within his own family structure, some began to question whether Roy's reach was expanding faster than his permission, and Roy felt it. He felt the pressure in how people's voices changed around him, but he felt it in the delays that had never existed before. He felt it in the way certain meetings suddenly required escorts. The machine was loud now, not on the streets, but in the power structure. Still, Roy pressed forward. He didn't retreat when pressure mounted. He tightened, he expanded the crew's resources, that he layered protection, that he refined disposal systems, that he widened the network of silence that to Roy DeMeo. Pressure didn't mean danger. It meant proof that what he built was working. But what he failed to see, or chose not to, was that his operation had grown beyond being merely useful. It was becoming irreplaceable. And in the world he lived in, nothing irreplaceable was ever allowed to survive forever. As the money machine grew louder behind closed doors, Roy DeMeo understood a dangerous truth. Systems only survive if people fear breaking them more than they fear obeying them. Profit brought loyalty at first, but fear was what made loyalty permanent. As Roy began to change the shape of his crew, he didn't expand recklessly. He selected carefully. Every new man was chosen not just for strength or nerve, but for emotional weakness. Roy preferred men with something missing: recognition, money, belonging, approval. These were the men who would bind themselves completely once Roy gave them a sense of power. Each recruit was tested, not with speeches, not with promises, with silence. Roy would give them small tasks first, jobs that carried risk but not exposure. A pickup here, a delivery there. Then he would watch. Who talked afterward? Who bragged? Who changed their routine suddenly? Anyone who did was discarded before they even understood they were no longer part of anything. What remained was a core of men who learned the first rule of the DeMeo crew. You never speak unless Roy speaks first. By the late 1970s, the crew had quietly transformed into something larger than a criminal outfit. It had become a private enforcement system, a shadow army used by higher powers whenever silence was required without public conflict. Roy did not advertise his services. His reputation moved through intermediaries. Deals were never discussed directly. If someone wanted a problem solved permanently, they didn't ask Roy. They asked someone who knew Roy. And if the answer came back, yes, the problem soon vanished. No questions, no noise, no evidence. Inside the crew, structure hardened. Everyone had a specific role. One drifted between tasks. One saw the full picture. Roy enforced separation with military discipline. The man handling logistics didn't know the man handling enforcement. The man handling money didn't know the man handling tears. Information moved upward in fragments and never flowed back down to it. Made betrayal nearly impossible, and it made Roy untouchable. What strengthened the crew most wasn't money. It was shared consequence. Once a man crossed a certain line for Roy, there was no way back into an ordinary life. Friendships outside the crew faded. Families became distant. Secrecy became instinct. The men stopped imagining futures that didn't include Roy. That was exactly what Roy wanted. As the crew expanded, so did the discipline. Mistakes were no longer tolerated. Early on, mercy had existed. By now, it had been fully removed from the process. Roy saw mercy as unpredictability. And unpredictability was vulnerability. When someone slipped, missed instructions, disrespected protocol, drew attention, Roy did not argue. He did not debate. He removed the variable. The rest of the crew learned faster from removals than they ever would have from warnings. Fear became automatic. Yet paradoxically, within the crew itself, Roy cultivated an atmosphere of professional calm. Meetings were quiet. Orders were brief. Emotional displays were discouraged. No shouting. No panic. No celebration. Men began to model themselves after Roy. Controlled, silent, detached. They were becoming reflections of his mind. Meanwhile, the money surged faster than ever. Multiple revenue streams flowed simultaneously: finance, stolen goods, side contracts, enforcement work, and connections with higher-ranking figures who paid for outcomes rather than methods. Roy was no longer just earning, that he was stabilizing entire criminal operations through silence. That made him indispensable, but it also made him heavy. Men at higher levels began to see Roy not as a tool, but as a structure. And structures are dangerous when they begin to support weight equal to those who sit above them. Whispers began, not loud ones, careful ones. Roy's crew is too big, too quiet, too efficient. Some envied him, some feared him. A few began to wonder what would happen if he ever turned his methods upward instead of sideways. Roy noticed the shift in tone, not through confrontation, but through hesitation. Routines slowed, access narrowed. Messages took longer to arrive. For the first time in years, the machine met resistance that didn't come from law enforcement. It came from suspicion within the hierarchy itself. Roy reacted the only way he ever did, by tightening. Trust became rarer. Access became narrower. Enforcement became more final. Instead of retreating, he refined his control to its sharpest edge yet. The DeMeo crew was no longer just feared on the streets, that IT was being studied behind closed doors. And in the world Roy lived in, being studied meant only one thing. You are being evaluated for eventual removal. Still, Roy moved forward without hesitation, because men like Roy DeMeo did not slow down when the horizon darkened. They accelerated. By the end of the 1970s, Roy DeMeo's name no longer traveled loudly. IT moved the way shadows move, quietly, automatically, without being announced. There were crews known for noise, for brutality that splashed into headlines. And then there was Roy. His reputation wasn't built on what people saw. It was built on what people never saw again. No bodies, no witnesses, no loose ends. Men didn't talk about what Roy did. They talked about the absence left behind. A bookmaker who vanished after disputing a percentage. A driver who disappeared after asking the wrong question. A fence who suddenly closed shop without warning. No funerals, no whispers of where they went. Just gaps in routines where people used to exist. This is how fear matured in Roy's world. Not as terror, but as certainty. What terrified people most was not that Roy killed. It was that life reorganized itself instantly after his decisions, as if his verdicts rewrote reality. The DeMeo crew began functioning as a ghost operation. They operated beneath conflict rather than inside it. While other factions fought publicly over territory and money, Roy's men moved in the negative space between disputes, cleaning what violence left behind before it ever registered. He became a mechanic of human erasure, and as his methods matured, so did his detachment. Roy no longer needed to personally oversee outcomes. His system could now execute without him. Orders moved through layers. Results returned without reports. His control had reached something close to automation. Inside the crew, something changed as well. Early fear had sharpened discipline. Now discipline hardened into routine. Routine dulled emotion. The men learned how to commit acts from which ordinary people never recover, and then leave the room to eat dinner without visible reaction. It wasn't courage. It was conditioning. Roy demanded emotional neutrality above all else. No raged, no pleasured, no regret. Emotion created fingerprints the law didn't even need to AT this stage. The DeMeo crew was being used not just for enforcement, but for containment. Other factions didn't want conflict that drew attention. They wanted quiet endings, problems that resolved without ripples. Roy had become the resolution specialist. But with that specialization came a disturbing truth. The crew saw too much. They handled matters no one else wanted proximity to. They learned patterns of movement, alliances, weaknesses. They understood internal conflicts that weren't meant to be visible. Information accumulated invisibly, and information, in Roy's hands, was leverage. This is when higher-level paranoia began to grow. Roy DeMeo was no longer just a problem solver. He was becoming a keeper of secrets that could collapse entire structures. People above him began to ask questions they never asked out loud. What does Roy know? Who depends on Roy? What happens if Roy stops taking orders? These were dangerous questions to exist in silence. Yet outwardly, nothing changed. Roy continued earning, that he continued solving, that he continued delivering results with surgical quiet. But internally, the tone of the underworld was shifting. Favor turned into caution. Respect turned into distance. Distance turned into preparation. Roy noticed the subtle signs: delayed responses, canceled meetings, more indirect communication. That he responded by becoming even quieter. The man who once built a system for survival had now built a system so effective that it threatened the people who depended on it. And in that world, effectiveness was never tolerated forever. At the same time, law enforcement had begun to feel something unnatural in Brooklyn's criminal ecosystem. Crimes occurred without aftermath. Disappearances stacked without evidence. The chaotic randomness investigators expected didn't exist anymore. They were sensing structure without being able to see it. But structure always creates patterns, and patterns eventually betray even the most careful architect. Roy DeMeo had pushed control to its highest point. The system worked flawlessly. Money rose steadily. Obstacles vanished without noise. But systems built on silence eventually echo in the wrong places. And those echoes were beginning to form. No one could yet see the collapse. But the pressure was already building behind the walls of Roy DeMeo's kingdom. The silence was still perfect, too perfect. Chapter 3. the first cracks in the silence. Every system, no matter how perfect it appears, eventually creates the very pattern it was designed to erase. For years, the disappearances surrounding Roy DeMeo felt random to the outside world. A man here, a rumor there, lives that simply folded inward and vanished without explanation. To police, these cases lived in separate files, scattered across precincts and counties, filed under missing persons, unresolved disputes, or quiet street violence with no witnesses. But by the early 1980s, something subtle began to change. The vanishings were no longer isolated dots. They were beginning to resemble a line. Detectives working Brooklyn and neighboring districts started to notice something unusual, not in what they saw, but in what they didn't. No bodies surfaced. No informants stepped forward. No accidental witnesses appeared. Even in a city as crowded and chaotic as New York, that level of silence was unnatural. Criminal activity always leaked. Except here, the silence itself became the clue. Internal reports began cross-referencing names from unrelated cases. A stolen car investigation in one borough. A missing debt collector in another. A drug inquiry that ended in sudden abandonment. When those names were layered together, one quiet pattern emerged. The same neighborhoods, the same social circles, the same invisible gravity pulling everything toward a single underground axis. And at the center of that axis sat Roy DeMeo, not a T first. His name appeared only in the margins. A casual contact, a rumored associate, a man known to be around certain former subjects of investigation. Nothing concrete, nothing actionable. But in long-term investigations, even margins matter. For law enforcement, this stage was the most frustrating. They didn't yet know what they were chasing, only that they were chasing something organized. Meanwhile, inside Roy's world, tension was rising in ways his crew could feel, but not yet articulate. More precautions, fewer meetings, stricter compartmentalization. Roy was adjusting again that he sensed pressure not from immediate danger, but from attention. And in his world, attention was the one threat that could not be neutralized with force at the same time. The underworld itself was shifting. Rival crews were becoming reckless. Federal pressure was increasing across organized crime networks nationwide. Informants were being flipped at rates unseen in previous decades. The old code of silence was weakening. Men were talking now, and Roy despised uncertainty more than he despised violence. His response was not explosive. It was systematic. He tightened internal operations first. Crew members were reevaluated not for loyalty, but for emotional stability. Anyone showing anxiety, guilt, paranoia, or hesitation was quietly sidelined. Roy believed fear expanded faster than courage. So fear had to be contained early. Second, he began shifting logistical patterns. Previously reliable locations were abandoned. Routines were disrupted intentionally. He introduced controlled unpredictability to prevent surveillance patterns from forming. But most importantly, Roy began testing how far his insulation truly protected him. He allowed smaller operations to intentionally brush law enforcement's awareness, not to attract prosecution, but to measure response time, resources, and investigative depth. He studied the system the way others studied enemies, and what he learned unsettled him. Law enforcement might have been slow, but it was no longer blind. Behind closed doors, federal agencies had begun building long-form intelligence profiles rather than reactive cases. They weren't waiting for arrests anymore. They were assembling networks, associations, communications, supply chains. In other words, the very architecture Roy had built was being mirrored from the outside. Still, Roy remained untouched. No charges, no public investigation, no subpoenas. And that created a dangerous illusion, one that history repeatedly shows to be fatal. Inside the crew, rumors began to surface, not spoken directly, but implied in behavior. Men asked fewer questions. Men trusted less easily. Men began to imagine futures that no longer stretched infinitely forward. Loyalty in the criminal world isn't broken by betrayal first, that it's broken by uncertainty. Roy sensed this psychological shift immediately, and for the first time since he built his system, he faced something he could not simply remove with precision. Doubt. Not doubt in his power, but doubt in the permanence of it. What troubled him most wasn't law enforcement. It was that his own machine, perfect as it had been engineered, was now producing a byproduct he had not anticipated: awareness. and awareness spreads. Somewhere between quiet phone calls, altered meeting locations, and delayed payoffs, Roy DeMeo began to realize a truth he had managed to avoid his entire career. A system built on silence eventually attracts those whose job is to listen. The cracks were still invisible from the outside, but inside the structure, they had begun. By the early 1980s, the quiet unease inside Roy DeMeo's world was no longer confined to shadows and instincts. What once felt like background pressure was now becoming a presence, subtle, patient, and steadily closing in. For years, investigators had chased pieces of crime that never seemed to fit together. Auto theft rings here, missing persons there, financial fraud cases that stalled without explanation. Each unit worked its own files, each detective staring at separate fragments of a puzzle no one realized was whole. But something began to change when federal attention widened. Instead of isolated street-level cases, analysts started tracking movement, who associated with whom, who appeared repeatedly near vanished figures, whose name returned quietly across unrelated reports. And in the background of more files than coincidence allowed, one figure kept drifting back into view: Roy DeMeo. Not accused, not charged, but present. The challenge wasn't proving what he'd done to IT, was proving what had disappeared because of him to in the criminal world. Violence often announces itself with chaos, sirens, witnesses, panic. But Roy's world produced none of that. It produced unexplained absences, and absences were nearly impossible to prosecute. You cannot arrest a man for something that left no evidence behind it. The strategy shifted. Instead of chasing crimes directly, authorities began studying the ecosystem around the crimes. The businesses, the financial patterns, the movement of goods, the sudden shutdowns of shops that once thrived. Patterns began to emerge in places no one had looked before. Auto shops that changed ownership overnight. Warehouses that appeared, operated briefly, and vanished. Small businesses that served as bridges between seemingly unrelated criminal threads. Everything circled the same gravity. Roy, meanwhile, was reading the air just as carefully as the agents watching him. He sensed that outcomes were no longer transferring upward as smoothly. Some requests for problem resolution were simply not coming anymore. Others were delayed or rerouted through unfamiliar intermediaries. This meant only one thing. Trust above him was thinning. To men like Roy, thinning trust was more dangerous than open hostility. An enemy declared himself. A skeptic prepared quietly, and so Roy prepared, too. The crew was pushed deeper into silence. Internal rules hardened. New restrictions on communication were enforced, not just about what to say, but about when, where, and to whom. Even longtime members found themselves isolated from one another in ways they'd never experienced before. IT created a strange tension within the group. Some men felt protected, others felt trapped. Roy told himself it was discipline. But discipline, without reassurance, often transforms into quiet resentment. Outside the crew, whispers grew more deliberate. People in adjacent networks began pulling back from shared ventures. Not because of what Roy had done, but because of what they feared he might represent to law enforcement scrutiny. Roy's specialization in silence had begun to work against him. The very reputation that once made him indispensable was now making others nervous to stand too close. And still, nothing touched him directly. No subpoenas, no arrests, no indictments. Just the slow tightening of distance. Law enforcement expanded its methodical approach. Surveillance grew patient. Financial markers were studied instead of street-level informants. They weren't trying to flip Roy's men anymore. They were trying to map the shadow his system cast. Inside the crew, Roy felt the shift in loyalty before anyone spoke of it. Some of his men were no longer thinking in years. They were thinking in exits. He could see it in their hesitation, in their careful phrasing, in the way they lingered at meetings just a moment too long before leaving. Fear had evolved. IT was no longer fear of our IT was fear of being too close to him when the silence finally broke. And that was the first real fracture in the machine. Roy tried to seal it with control, but control cannot erase doubt once doubt takes root. What neither side fully understood yet was that the next phase would not arrive like a storm. It would arrive quietly, through a single failure, a single unexpected survival, a single mistake that refused to disappear. The warning signs were no longer abstract. The pattern had become visible, and somewhere within that widening pattern, The first undeniable thread was already being pulled. For nearly a decade, Roy DeMeo's greatest protection wasn't his violence, that it was his absence of mistakes. In a world where even the most careful criminals eventually tripped over impulse, ego, or betrayal, Roy had built a reputation for perfection. Jobs ended cleanly. Problems vanished permanently. No one survived long enough to contradict the stories that replaced them. Until one day, someone did. The event itself didn't explode across headlines. There were no breaking news alerts, no public manhunts, no sudden raids. It arrived the way real danger often does in Roy's world, quietly, as a rumor that refused to stay contained that a man had escaped the tea first. Roy dismissed it as noise. Street talk always exaggerated survival stories. Men claimed to have seen ghosts. Cowards invented escapes to inflate their own legend. But as the days passed, the whispers sharpened instead of fading. Details appeared, specifics, names, places. That was when Roy knew something had gone wrong. For the first time in years, there existed a human variable outside his control. Someone who could speak, remember, and connect pieces that were meant never to be connected. And memory, in criminal investigations, is more dangerous than any weapon. Inside the DeMeo crew, the atmosphere changed instantly. Where there had once been routine calm, now there was tightness. Where silence had once felt disciplined, now it felt strained. Men watched one another more closely. Conversations shortened. Trust narrowed. Roy responded the only way he ever did. He aimed to reassert finality. But something had changed that could not be undone with precision alone. The story had already leaked beyond the crew. Law enforcement, who had spent years mapping shadows, suddenly had something they hadn't possessed before, a living contradiction to the pattern of disappearance. Investigators were careful. They didn't rush. They didn't announce. They listened. Every fragment of testimony was cross-checked against years of quiet data. Missing persons, financial movements, auto theft routes, associates tied to Roy through business and proximity. What had once looked like coincidence now aligned like architecture. The machine was becoming visible. Roy sensed it immediately. Not through charges, but through the behavior of those above and below him. Requests slowed. Access tightened. Conversations grew indirect. Men who once moved comfortably in his orbit were suddenly cautious about being seen near him. For the first time in his career, Roy felt something unfamiliar. Vulnerability, not fear, not regret, but exposure that he responded by hardening further. The crew was pulled inward. Operations became smaller, tighter, more isolated. Roy reduced contact even with longtime associates. He no longer delegated sensitive outcomes. He controlled them personally again, the way he had at the beginning. Yet the difference now was this. He was reacting, not leading. Above him, the criminal hierarchy was shifting its posture. Roy was no longer viewed only as an asset. He was now being assessed as a liability vector, a concentration point where too many dangers intersected. Below him, his crew felt it too. Some remained fiercely loyal. Others began mapping quiet exits, not defecting to law enforcement, just drifting away from proximity. In Roy's world, distance was the new survival instinct. And for the first time, Roy couldn't remove distance. Meanwhile, investigators began doing what they had waited years to do. They stopped chasing individual acts. They started building a case against a system. Phones were monitored. Financial trails were layered. Business fronts were mapped. Connections were threaded into charts that grew denser by the month. For years, Roy had erased individuals. Now law enforcement was trying to erase his invisibility. The most dangerous shift, however, wasn't happening in police stations or courtrooms. It was happening inside Roy himself. He had always believed that control came from silence. Now silence felt different. Now silence felt like attention waiting for confirmation. The machine he had built was no longer expanding. It was holding its breath. And in that held breath lived the first undeniable truth Roy could not engineer away. The era of perfect disappearance was ending. The silence had finally made too much noise. Chapter 4. The walls begin to close. Pressure rarely arrives as a sudden force. It enters quietly, politely, like a guest who insists they're only stopping by for a moment, and then never leaves. By the early 1980s, the pressure around Roy DeMeo had reached that stage. On the surface, everything still looked functional. Money continued to move through the pipelines. Front businesses still operated. The crew still followed orders with mechanical precision. To anyone watching casually, Roy's world looked unchanged. But beneath that surface, the rhythm was off. Phone calls grew shorter. Meetings became rarer. Decisions that once took minutes now took days. The machine still ran, but no longer effortlessly. Roy felt it most clearly in how superiors began speaking to him. Where once instructions had been confident and direct, they were now delivered with caution and buffering. Where access had once been open, it was now filtered. The unspoken question lived beneath every interaction. Is Roy still an asset, or has he become a risk? Above him, the structure of the Gambino crime family was shifting. Key figures were repositioning. Alliances were tightening. And as those power lines shifted, Roy's name appeared more often in conversations that were not meant to be overheard. He was no longer just being used. He was being measured. At the same time, law enforcement pressure became more deliberate. Instead of random patrol attention or disconnected investigations, a new kind of presence settled around Roy's orbit. Slower, quieter, patient. Surveillance that did not announce itself. Financial scrutiny that moved in months rather than days. Roy didn't learn this through arrest, he learned it through absence. Old contacts stopped answering. Routine deliveries were delayed without explanation. Certain pipelines quietly dried up. These weren't law enforcement moves. These were protective withdrawals. People who once depended on Roy were beginning to distance themselves, not out of betrayal, but out of fear of proximity. In organized crime, distance is often the first sign that someone may soon be sacrificed. Inside the DeMeo crew, Roy tightened control once more. Internal travel was restricted. Outside communication was minimized. That face-to-face contact became mandatory for sensitive matters. He rechecked loyalty through behavior rather than confession. Who hesitated? Who lingered? Who avoided eye contact when certain names were mentioned? Roy's mind functioned like a radar now, constantly scanning for emotional tremors. Some of his men held firm. Others began slipping into psychological retreat. They didn't defect. They didn't flee. They simply started imagining lives beyond Roy. And imagination, in Roy's world, was the first stage of disobedience. For the crew, the emotional weight was beginning to rival the operational one. Years of silence had trained them to suppress reaction, but suppression creates pressure of its own. Without outlets, fear compresses inward. Men became irritable, withdrawn, hypervigilant. Roy noticed, and for the first time, he was not merely managing behavior, he was managing stress fractures and loyalty at the same time. The external world was growing bolder. Detectives who had long sensed a hidden structure were now exchanging information across unit boundaries. Patterns that once lived in isolated filing cabinets were being layered into composite profiles. Still, no arrests. Still, no charges. Just the quiet sound of walls being traced. That Roy's greatest protection had always been invisibility. He did not exist clearly enough in any one place to be targeted directly. But now, the contours of his presence were becoming visible through aggregate detail, and no single piece proved anything. Together, they built shape, and shape is what hunters seek. Roy responded not by retreating, but by compressing further. The crew became even more inward-facing. He began exploring contingency routes, fallback operations, alternative pipelines, redundant protections. Every system now required a backup. What he could not create, however, was a backup for reputation. Once a man becomes associated with too much silence, too many disappearances, too much unresolved pressure, his reputation turns from shield into target. Roy could feel that shift. Men still respected him, but respect was no longer synonymous with safety. Somewhere between the tightening of operations and the softening of loyalty, Roy DeMeo entered the most dangerous phase of any criminal career. The phase where survival requires not only controlling enemies, but surviving allies. There is a moment in every hidden empire when protection quietly changes its meaning. At first, protection is a shield. Men watching doorways, silence guarding conversations, power ensuring safety. But when empires grow too heavy, too visible in their invisibility, protection slowly reshapes itself into something else entirely. At observation, by the early 1980s, Roy DeMeo could feel that shift in the air around him. It wasn't announced. No one pulled him aside and explained that the rules had changed. Instead, The change revealed itself through subtle distortions in the world he had once ruled with certainty. Men who once arrived promptly now arrived carefully. Messages that once carried confidence now carried tone. Questions that once sounded like requests now sounded like measurements. Roy had always known that upper-level figures monitored everyone beneath them. That was the nature of power. But this was different. This monitoring was no longer about efficiency. It was about evaluation that he was being studied like a structural weakness. Inside the crew, the tension deepened. Trust, once enforced by fear, now competed with survival instinct. Some of his men still believed in the system completely, believed that Roy's structure was unbreakable, that silence would always protect them. Others were no longer so sure. The difference showed in their eyes. Roy watched his crew the way architects watch old buildings after an earthquake, not for collapse, but for hairline cracks that might travel unnoticed until everything comes down at once. He began rotating responsibilities with greater frequency. No one stayed too long in a single role. No one was allowed to become indispensable in the same way he had once been. This wasn't just operational strategy anymore. The IT was containment psychology. Roy knew what happened when men felt essential. They became risk-takers. He would not allow anyone beneath him to grow large enough to attract the scrutiny now circling him. Externally, the underworld had begun to treat Roy differently as well. People did not confront him. They maneuvered around him. Deals that once flowed freely through his network now detoured through quieter conduits. Roy was still involved, but no longer central. Information reached him later than it once had. Decisions arrived pre-shaped, already negotiated elsewhere. That was the clearest signal of all. He was being managed, not consulted. And in Roy's world, being managed meant direction without protection. Somewhere above him, strategies were forming that did not include his long-term survival. At the same time, law enforcement pressure evolved into something colder and more calculated. Surveillance widened. Financial oversight deepened. Detective units exchanged files that had once lived in separate silos. They weren't building cases against men anymore. They were building cases against systems, and Roy was a system. Every disappearance, every business front, every unexplained shift in operations, each detail added weight to a silent ledger now growing on the other side of the law. Roy could feel that accumulation without ever seeing it, not in arrests, not in summons, but in anticipation. The streets began to anticipate something coming. Inside the crew, rumors grew heavier. No one spoke openly, but speculation drifted through posture and avoidance. Some men started moving money quietly. Others began reconnecting with distant family under harmless pretenses. Everyone felt change approaching, but no one knew its shape. Roy, for the first time in years, began to wonder if silence still worked the same way it once had. He had always believed that silence erased trails. Now silence itself was being tracked. That realization did not frighten him. It sharpened him. Roy became more reclusive. He reduced his appearances. Meetings were shortened further. Intermediaries handled even routine communication. If he once commanded the room, now he controlled the corridors that led to it. Yet despite every precaution, the impossible pressure remained. Roy DeMeo was too effective to be ignored, too dangerous to be trusted, too embedded to be removed quickly. That made him an unstable constant. And unstable constants eventually forced decisions, from above, from outside, from within. The dangerous thing about empires built on silence is that when the silence breaks, it does not crack gently. It collapses. Suddenly, Roy did not yet hear the collapse, but he felt its weight shifting. In the world Roy DeMeo lived in, the most important decisions were never announced. They were understood. No letter was delivered. No warning was spoken aloud. No meeting was called to explain what came next. The verdict against a man like Roy was not handed down in words. It formed slowly in quiet conversations he was never part of, in rooms he was no longer invited into, in glances that lingered a second too long before turning away. Above him, the machinery of organized power had reached a conclusion that no one dared to state plainly. Roy DeMeo had become too heavy to carry. For years, he had been the solution to problems no one else wanted to touch. He had erased obstacles, stabilized cash flow, enforced discipline without noise. But now his very effectiveness had made him radioactive. Too many disappearances. Too much silence. Too many unresolved patterns that pointed in only one direction. Power structures tolerate chaos better than they tolerate attention, and Roy was drawing attention without headlines. Which was worse? The verdict wasn't about punishment, that it was about survival. From Roy's side, the world felt altered but not yet hostile. He still moved freely, still met with old contacts, still commanded obedience from his inner circle. But the atmosphere had changed in ways that instinct recognized before logic could confirm. The warmth of familiarity was gone. Where once he had been greeted with confidence, now he was met with restraint. Where once he had been given access, now he was given explanations. Where once his words settled disputes, now disputes were settled before his word arrived. Roy had crossed from essential to expendable without being told. Inside his crew, the psychological tension reached a new intensity. Some men felt the shift as relief, a hope that maybe the pressure would move upward and away from them. Others felt it as dread, the fear that when Roy fell, everyone close to him would fall with him. One spoke openly, but everyone watched. Roy noticed the stillness. He noticed how conversations stopped when he entered certain rooms. He noticed how decisions were framed as updates instead of consultations. He noticed how his name was used less frequently in plans that once revolved around him. And for the first time, he began to seriously consider a future that did not involve expansion, not growth, not dominance, just survival. That alone marked a transformation. For years, Roy DeMeo had never scaled back. He only tightened forward. Now he began quietly exploring exits without revealing that's what he was doing. He inquired about legitimate investments. He adjusted financial structures. He moved resources in ways that suggested insulation rather than conquest. To some, these moves looked responsible. To others, they looked like preparation. Above him, the verdict hardened into certainty. The longer Roy existed in this tension state, the more dangerous he became, not because of what he might do, but because of what he might know when he realized his position. Indispensable men are dangerous when they stop believing they're protected. The strategy from above shifted from evaluation to containment. Roy was not to be removed suddenly. He was to be isolated slowly, cut from certain revenue streams, separated from sensitive operations, excluded from future planning, not as punishment. As precaution, Roy felt the walls narrowing, not as physical confinement, but as relevance slipping through his hands. And in his world, irrelevance was a kind of death that always came before the real one. Yet, even now, with pressure rising, with protection becoming distance, with allies becoming observers, Roy DeMeo remained composed. He did not plead. He did not lash out. He did not confront the shift directly. That, too, frightened the people who watched him most closely, because men like Roy did not collapse under pressure. They adapted, and adapt quickly. Somewhere in the silent space between surveillance and suspicion, power and fear, allegiance and abandonment, Roy DeMeo crossed a threshold he could never uncross. The unspoken verdict had been reached. The only question that remained was not if it would be enforced, but how and when. Chapter 5. Isolation. Isolation does not arrive with emptiness. It arrives with distance. Not the distance of miles, but the distance of tone, timing, and trust. And by the time Roy DeMeo entered this phase of his life, that distance surrounded him on every side. For years, Roy had been at the center of movement. Information flowed toward him. Requests passed through him. Decisions bent around his presence. Now, that flow had shifted. It didn't stop. It simply moved around him. He could feel it in the silence after conversations ended, in the delay before answers arrived, in the way certain names were no longer spoken in his presence. He was still respected, but respect was no longer protection. Inside the upper structure of the Gambino crime family, Roy's relevance was being carefully reduced without confrontation. This was not how hot-headed men were removed. This was how dangerous men were neutralized, slowly, invisibly, without provoking reaction. Roy understood what this meant on an instinctive level. He was being cut loose without being cut down. Operational pipelines that once fed directly into his channels had been redirected. He noticed it first through money. Payments that once arrived predictably now arrived smaller, later, and sometimes not at all. Business fronts he once supervised directly were now reporting through intermediaries. Even loyalty was changing definition. The men who remained closest to him were no longer there only because they believed in Craig's system. Some were there because they had nowhere else to go. Others because leaving felt too dangerous. A few because herd instinct kept them frozen. Roy could see these motivations tangled together in their behavior. No one spoke plainly anymore. The certainty that once shaped every meeting had been replaced by politeness. And politeness, in Roy's world, was a warning. For the first time in his career, he began reducing outward operations rather than expanding them. Risk management replaced growth strategy. He focused on insulating finances, creating layers between himself and anything that could later be used as leverage. This wasn't retirement. It was preparation without admission. Home. The contrast between his private life and his collapsing influence grew sharper. Family routines continued. Neighbors still nodded in passing. The ordinary world still accepted him without suspicion. There were moments when that normalcy felt almost surreal, as if his two lives were drifting out of alignment. He had spent decades mastering compartmentalization. Now, the compartments were drifting apart. Inside the crew, isolation manifested differently. Roy had once moved effortlessly among his men. Now, even when surrounded, he felt alone. Conversations carried formality instead of familiarity. Humor vanished. Disagreements softened into silence. They were afraid to speak incorrectly. That fear did not comfort him. It unsettled him. Because fear without confidence becomes unstable, he began receiving fragments of information rather than clarity. Hints of shifting alliances. Subtle warnings disguised as casual remarks. The kind of intelligence that didn't confirm anything, but suggested too much. Still, no one challenged him directly. This made the danger harder to define and harder to defend against. Roy began tightening his personal sphere. He limited contact even with long-trusted associates. He rarely stayed in one place too long. Schedules changed without warning. Communication passed through filtered layers. For the first time, Roy DeMeo was not expanding control, that he was defending territory that no longer extended as far as it once had. Even the streets seemed different. Where once fear had moved ahead of him like a shadow, now it followed at a careful distance. People still moved aside, but with eyes that measured rather than surrendered. The atmosphere no longer bent in anticipation of his presence. It waited. That was new. Above him, decisions were still being made. Below him, loyalty was still being tested. Around him, time was doing what no rival ever could, narrowing his world. And for a man who had built power through endless expansion, isolation was not merely an inconvenience. It was a transformation. Not yet a fall, but no longer a rise. Isolation changes a man in ways that power never can. For Roy DeMeo, the silence that once worked as a shield now pressed against him like a closing wall. He had built his life around influence, around being the axis that others rotated around. Now, that rotation had slowed. The world still moved, but no longer through him. The hardest part wasn't the loss of control. It was the loss of certainty. Roy had always known where he stood. With enemies, with allies, with superiors, with subordinates. The rules might have been brutal, but they were clear. Now, the rules were blurred. Intentions were hidden behind courtesy. Warnings were disguised as small talk. Even silence no longer meant safety. It meant calculation. He began to feel watched not only by law enforcement or rivals, but by the very structure that had once protected him. In the past, protection had felt solid, tangible in the form of reassurances, favors, and access. Now it was abstract, unspoken, unreliable. The old invisible safety net had thinned to threads. Roy responded by retreating further inward. He spent more time alone. He trusted fewer voices. He replayed conversations in his mind long after they ended. For a man trained to act, forced stillness became its own form of pressure. Inside his organization, men who once approached him freely now did so carefully. Every interaction carried an unspoken tension. Is this a request or a test? Roy learned to listen not just to what was said, but to what was avoided. Names left unmentioned, topics redirected too quickly, meetings that ended early for no clear reason. These were the new signals of danger. Roy began running personal risk assessments the way others balanced ledgers. Who still relied on him directly? Who had shifted their financial dependencies? Who might benefit most from his absence? The answers were no longer obvious, and that uncertainty eroded the strategic clarity he had once relied upon. Worse still, he sensed that some of his own men had begun hedging their futures, not defecting, not betraying, just quietly imagining survival without him. That kind of mental separation is invisible until it suddenly becomes action. At home, Roy's isolation looked different. His family saw more of him physically, but less of him emotionally. He was present, but distant. Conversations stayed shallow. His mind lived elsewhere, tracing invisible lines of threat and movement. The safety of his domestic life, which once grounded him, now made him uneasy. It reminded him of what could be lost. In the underworld, loss was expected. In ordinary life, it felt terrifying. Roy had always controlled fear from the outside. Now he was negotiating with it on the inside. The city around him moved on, unaware. Streets filled. Businesses opened and shut. New faces replaced old ones. The world didn't slow for power shifts in shadow empires. That indifference was its own kind of warning. Roy had built something massive. Now he was learning how quietly massive things could be dismantled. He still had resources, he still had loyalists, he still had fear working in his favor, but the balance had shifted from dominance to defense. Power is loud when it's growing. It is silent when it is being prepared for removal. Roy DeMeo was now living in that silence. And somewhere beyond his narrowing circle, preparations were no longer theoretical, they were active. By the time Roy DeMeo reached the deepest stage of his isolation, the world no longer felt like something he was moving through. It felt like something that was slowly circling him. For most of his life, Roy had existed inside currents of motion, deals moving, money shifting, favors traded, problems erased. Even during moments of pressure, there had always been movement. Now, the movement was gone. What remained was a strange stillness that made every small sound feel louder than it should. Stillness is dangerous for men who survive through motion. Roy noticed how time stretched differently. Days felt longer. Nights became heavier. He slept less, not because of panic, but because his mind refused to disengage. When a man has spent decades mastering control, the loss of it does not feel like chaos at first. It feels like waiting without a schedule. He became hypersensitive to patterns. The same cars passing his street more than once. The same faces lingering in familiar places. Conversations that ended just a little too quickly when he entered a room. None of it was dramatic. All of it was cumulative. Roy had once thrived on uncertainty. Now uncertainty was the only constant. For the first time in his career, he began to experience what the men around him had felt for years. The sensation that something unseen was shaping the future without asking permission. Inside his shrinking circle, loyalties did not collapse in a single moment. They thinned. A man who once called every day now called once a week. A trusted messenger was suddenly unavailable more often than before. Meetings were postponed without explanation. No confrontation, no accusation. Just withdrawal. And withdrawal, in Roy's world, meant preparation. That he still carried the respect his reputation commanded. People watched their words around him. They chose politeness over honesty. But politeness does not protect a man when the structures behind him begin to shift. Roy understood this better than anyone. That he had built systems that removed men without warning. Now he was watching a system quietly reposition itself around him. There were moments, rare, fleeting, when something like reflection surfaced. Not regret. Roy did not think in that language. But calculation reached backward instead of forward. He considered decisions that had placed too much weight on permanence. He thought about how effectiveness had blinded him to the moment when he crossed from useful to dangerous. Yet even this reflection was not emotional. It was analytical. He wasn't asking, "What did I do wrong?" He was asking, which variable finally shifted. At home, the strain appeared in subtle ways. He became quieter at the dinner table, more distant in routine conversations. His family saw a man who was physically present but mentally elsewhere. They could not see the invisible pressures compressing the world around him. To them, life looked unchanged. To Roy, it felt like the final phase of an equation that had been forming for years. The most unnerving part of isolation is not the loneliness. It is the lack of confirmation. Roy did not know if decisions had already been made above him. He did not know how much law enforcement knew. He did not know how long the balance would hold. All he knew was that the protective silence he had engineered His entire life was now pressing inward instead of outward. He responded the only way he could, by doing nothing visibly wrong. That he avoided rash moves, that he avoided confrontation, that he avoided escalation. Stillness became strategy, but stillness also made him visible in ways movement never had. The world he once ruled through disappearance now waited for something to finally appear, and for the first time in years, Roy DeMeo was no longer shaping the future, he was bracing for it. The man who had once erased endings for others was now living inside his own prolonged anticipation, a space where danger had not yet arrived, but had clearly chosen a direction. Chapter 6. The Net Tightens. By the early 1980s, the pressure around Roy DeMeo was no longer subtle. The quiet unease that once lived only in the corners of his awareness had begun to harden into something heavier, more structured. This was no longer just suspicion drifting through the background of his life. This was a tightening presence, deliberate, patient, and methodical. For years, law enforcement had struggled to define the shape of what they were chasing. They knew violence surrounded certain circles. They saw patterns that felt intentional but could not yet be proven. People vanished, investigations stalled, witnesses disappeared into silence. But what had once looked like fog was now slowly sharpening into outlines. This was the phase where preparation became pursuit. IT began with surveillance. Not dramatic, not obvious. No flashing lights. No public confrontations. Just quiet observations, routine traffic stops, careful listening. Phone lines were treated differently. Financial movements were tracked more closely. Associations were mapped instead of dismissed. Every small detail was treated like another thread in a web that was slowly being woven. Roy felt the shift before he could fully explain it. There was a change in how often he saw unfamiliar faces in familiar places. The rhythm of the city seemed slightly off-kilter, as if the environment itself no longer moved according to old rules. The casual insulation he'd relied on, the assumption that certain layers would always stay between him and exposure, no longer felt guaranteed. Still, Roy did not react with panic. Men like him rarely do. Instead, he tightened his own world. He minimized what could be seen, reduced movement, shortened conversations. He became more careful about who knew where he was and when. Every interaction became more deliberate, every favor more conditional. This wasn't fear in the emotional sense. This was containment. Inside his remaining inner circle, the atmosphere grew thick with unspoken caution. Loyalties were no longer assumed. They were evaluated continuously. Even longtime associates felt the quiet recalibration taking place. No one said it aloud, but everyone sensed that the margin for error had collapsed. The most dangerous thing in any underground structure is not exposure. It's uncertainty, because uncertainty makes men talk. Roy understood that law enforcement did not need everyone. They only needed one weak link. One man who felt abandoned. One man who felt underestimated. One man who believed he could save himself by turning outward what had once been turned inward. And by now, there were plenty of men who had reason to fear being left behind. Some of Roy's former associates had already drifted to the edges. Not expelled, not executed, just absorbed into irrelevance. And irrelevance creates desperation. Desperation makes self-preservation louder than loyalty. Roy began to see hearing instead of loyalty in the eyes of certain men. That was new. He had built his life on being the final authority in every fear-based decision. Now some of that fear was beginning to aim elsewhere, not out of confidence, but out of survival instinct at the same time. The legal world was shifting beneath the surface. Investigators were no longer looking only for direct proof. They were building cases through accumulation, patterns, associations, financial inconsistencies, timeline overlaps. Cases that once lived as fragments were being stitched together slowly, not to accuse, but to understand. Roy had always survived by staying ahead of understanding. Now he saw what happened when understanding learned patience. Publicly, nothing had changed, that he still moved through familiar spaces, still spoke with calm authority, still presented the image of an established figure whose structure appeared intact. To outsiders, he looked like a man of consistency, but inside, the environment had changed from flexible to brittle. Every small disturbance now threatened to fracture something larger. There were nights when Roy sat alone long after the house had gone quiet, not thinking about escape or confession, but calculation. He replayed old decisions with a new question in mind. Not was it effective, but was it traceable? Effectiveness had once been his currency. Now it was becoming his footprint. Even so, he did not attempt to run. Men like Roy rarely do. Running is an admission that the system has failed. And Roy still believed, perhaps out of discipline, perhaps out of denial, that the system could withstand pressure longer than the people applying it. What he didn't yet fully see was that the system he trusted was no longer unified. Power had begun to decentralize, and in that decentralization, protection becomes selective. The city itself seemed to mirror his state of tension. Government pressure on criminal structures increased. Prosecutions became more methodical. Laws changed. Techniques evolved. Wire protocols tightened. Technology crept forward, reducing the safety of silence. The world was learning how to listen better. Roy, who had once thrived in a world where listening was blunt and dangerous, now faced one where listening was invisible and precise. Every passing week felt like the tightening of a cord that had not yet snapped. He could sense that history had begun to lean in his direction. But history never moves loudly at first, that IT whispers. By the time the first true fractures began to appear, they did not arrive with explosions or public arrests. They arrived quietly, the way rot spreads through wood, slowly at first, then all at once. Roy DeMeo had built his world on control, predictability, and fear. But fear, when pushed too hard and too long, has a way of turning inward. The earliest signs showed up in behavior. Men who once moved with confidence around him now hesitated before speaking. Conversations that once flowed freely became clipped, cautious. Eyes dropped more often. Laughter sounded rehearsed. The rhythm was wrong. Roy noticed everything. He always had. And what he noticed most now was the absence of certainty. Certainty had been his true currency. For years, people believed that being near him was safer than being away. That belief was fading. Not because his reputation had weakened, but because the world around him had changed. The pressure coming from law enforcement was no longer abstract. It was no longer rumors passed in back rooms. It had become systematic, coordinated, relentless. Investigators weren't rushing anymore. They were building. Patiently, files thickened, timelines lengthened. Patterns that once seemed disconnected began to align. Every phone call, every meeting, every financial irregularity was recorded, cross-referenced, categorized. The goal was no longer to catch a single act. The goal was to understand the full shape of the operation. And once you understand the shape of something, you can dismantle it. Inside Roy's shrinking circle, paranoia began to compete with discipline. There is a difference between controlled caution and corrosive suspicion. Roy had always ruled through controlled fear. Fear that had direction, hierarchy, consequence. But now fear no longer had a clear target. Everyone felt exposed. This was the phase where loyalty began to fracture into survival, that a man who fears punishment will stay silent, that a man who fears prison will eventually speak. Roy knew this intellectually. He had used this truth against others many times. But living inside the reality of it was different. He could no longer assume that fear pointed only toward him. Some fear was now pointing toward the outside world, toward prosecutors, toward deals, toward immunity, toward escape. On the surface, Roy remained steady. He did not lash out. He did not make sweeping changes. He did not erupt with visible anger. That restraint, in a strange way, unnerved the people around him even more. They had grown accustomed to his intensity. Now they were watching a man trying to compress a collapsing structure with stillness. IT was not working. Behind closed doors, decisions grew heavier. Trust lists shortened. Communication chains narrowed. When information moves through fewer hands, it becomes harder to verify and easier to distort. Mistrust became self-feeding. One man suspected another. Another began to suspect two more. The web of suspicion spread faster than any single betrayal. Roy began to feel the pressure not just from above, from law enforcement, but from within. The most dangerous environments are not the ones under attack. They are the ones that no longer know who is standing with whom. Financial channels became unstable. Money slowed. Movement tightened. Deals that once flowed smoothly grew tangled in delays and second-guessing. Income that had once been routine now arrived inconsistently. And inconsistency is poison in any system built on confidence. Roy could feel the ground shifting beneath the operation he had spent decades refining. not breaking, shifting. Every system can survive blows. Few survive realignment that he began conducting his own quiet evaluations, not of law enforcement, but of the men around him. Who was still moving with intention? Who was avoiding eye contact? Who asked too many questions? Who had begun speaking less, not out of caution, but out of calculation? Silence can mean loyalty, but it can also mean preparation. The emotional weight of this period was something Roy had never truly experienced before. Not fear in the traditional sense, but a controlled dread that settles into the body and refuses to leave. It does not sprint. It does not scream. It simply stays. And when dread stays long enough, it changes how a man breathes, how he listens, how he reacts to pauses in conversation that once felt harmless. The city outside moved on, unaware of the internal collapse taking shape beneath its surface. To the public, nothing seemed altered. No headlines screamed his name. No sirens signaled catastrophe. Life continued as it always had. But underground, everything was tightening. Roy had once been the architect of pressure applied outward. Now the pressure was curving back toward him. Still, he did not run. Still, he did not break. He believed the structure could hold, because it always had. What he did not yet fully accept was that the structure was no longer his alone, that IT was now being tested by forces that did not operate by the same rules. And those forces did not need fear to function. They only needed time. By the time the final phase of pressure set in, Roy DeMeo no longer felt like a man being hunted. He felt like a man being waited out. The difference was subtle, but it changed everything. Hunting implies motion, noise, pursuit. Waiting is colder. It is patient. It allows the target to exhaust itself. For the first time in his life, Roy was operating inside a shrinking perimeter that he did not control. The city no longer felt like a stage he moved across. It felt like something watching him move. Every routine became heavier. The same streets he had traveled for years now felt longer. The same faces felt unfamiliar, even when he recognized them. The illusion of dominance had not shattered outwardly, but internally it was unraveling thread by thread. And still, no arrest, no direct confrontation, no dramatic warnings. That silence was the loudest signal of all, because silence meant preparation was complete. Inside his world, paranoia no longer drifted, it rooted. Men who once took orders without hesitation now requested confirmations, delays, second opinions. Every hesitation felt like a question mark. Every question mark felt like a threat. The operation had not collapsed in chaos. It was collapsing in uncertainty. Roy could feel power leaving him in increments too small for anyone else to measure. And that is how power actually disappears, not in explosions. In transfers. He began to sense that conversations were happening without him. Meetings he once commanded were now happening elsewhere, under different authority. Information arrived slower. Decisions passed through intermediaries that he was still respected. But respect is not the same as control. For a man like Roy, this distinction was suffocating. The system he had built through fear was encountering a force fear cannot govern: self-preservation. Men who once believed they would either rise or fall with him were now quietly calculating survival paths that did not include his name. Not betrayal in the classic sense, repositioning. And repositioning is invisible until you are no longer centered. At home, time slowed even further. Television murmured in the background without being watched. Meals were eaten out of habit rather than hunger. Sleep arrived in fragments. His mind replayed not emotions, but probabilities. He was not asking whether it would happen, only when, and from which direction. Danger is a strange companion when it stays too long. It does not provoke adrenaline anymore. It becomes familiar. There were moments when Roy sensed that even the inevitability itself had begun to take shape. Not as dread, but as an approaching certainty too large to ignore. The kind of certainty that does not rush to arrival because it understands it does not need to. No man lives for decades inside violence, without sensing patterns. And Roy could feel the pattern narrowing. He had removed countless endings from other men's lives without ceremony. No explanations. No farewell. Just absence. Now he lived inside the same absence, stretched over time, watching his own world remove itself piece by piece. What haunted him was not guilt. It was symmetry. The symmetry of cause and consequence finally aligning. By this point, law enforcement no longer needed panic. They had constructed something stronger: inevitability. Files were complete, timelines stable, connections verified. The machinery of consequence had already been set in motion. It simply had not yet reached the final turn of the wheel. Roy was no longer being pursued as a predator, he was being processed as an outcome. Even then, even now, he did not run. Some men flee when they feel death approaching. Roy stood still, not out of bravery. Out of familiarity, he had built his life on the idea that hesitation is weakness. That control, even when challenged, must appear absolute. Running would have contradicted everything he believed himself to be. He remained inside the narrowing walls of his environment, waiting without saying the word waiting. The city did not mark the moment when everything shifted. Sirens announced the final phase. Headlines predicted what was coming. Public signal revealed the collapse underway. That IT unfolded below the surface, as it always had. Quietly, deliberately, inevitably. And as the last layer of insulation began to fade, Roy DeMeo found himself standing at the edge of a future that no longer needed his permission to arrive. Chapter 7. The Turning of Tides. By the time the tides truly began to turn, there was no single moment anyone could point to and say, "That's when everything changed." The shift did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like water creeping slowly across the floor, unnoticed at first, undeniable only when it was already too late to stop. For Roy DeMeo, this was the phase where pressure finally became visible, not loud, not explosive, but undeniable. Small things began surfacing in the public world. Names he recognized appeared more often in legal documents. Investigations that once stayed buried in rumor now floated closer to daylight. The distance between what happened behind closed doors and what entered official record began to shrink. The separation he had always relied on, that invisible wall between underground and public life, had started to fracture for the first time in years. Roy saw the consequence of attention. It wasn't law enforcement at the door. It was the awareness of law enforcement everywhere. He felt it in the way streets were watched more closely. In the way routine stops became slightly more frequent. In the way questions lingered just a little too long. That he was no longer invisible. That alone was destabilizing. Inside his circle, reactions differed. Some men doubled down on their allegiance, moving closer in a way that felt almost desperate. Others quietly loosened their proximity, creating distance without formally withdrawing. Both responses came from fear, but different types of it. Fear can pull people inward. Fear can also push them away. Roy watched both happen at the same time. The most dangerous change wasn't visibility. It was predictability. Once law enforcement begins to move with consistency instead of reaction, the underground loses its greatest advantage: uncertainty. Surprise no longer belongs to the shadows. It belongs to the structure that watches without being seen. Roy had excelled in chaotic environments. Now he was facing an orderly one. Meetings that once felt routine now carried weight. Every exchange was layered with unspoken questions. Who knows what? Who is talking? Who is listening? These were not questions men said aloud. They were written in posture, tone, and timing. Roy had always relied on his ability to read those signals. It had kept him ahead for decades. But now the signals contradicted one another. Loyalty and fear intertwined so tightly that motivation was no longer clear. That a man could be loyal and terrified at the same time. That unpredictability unsettled him more than any single threat. The streets outside had not changed, but his relationship to them had. Familiar routes no longer felt like territories, they felt like timelines. Each movement carried the silent question of whether it would be observed, recorded, or remembered later in a context he could not influence. Roy did not show this tension outwardly. That he refined his calm, not for comfort, for concealment. There was also a subtle transformation in how authority itself behaved around him. People who once displayed deference now maintained formality instead. The warmth of fear had cooled into the neutrality of caution. That might sound like an improvement to ordinary people. To Roy, it felt like exile without departure. Neutrality means protection has ended, and protection is the last currency that disappears before a structure collapses. Behind the scenes, decisions were being made beyond his influence. Former allies were negotiating without him. Information trafficked along channels he could no longer fully see. Some of these shifts were based in fear of law enforcement. Others were based purely on survival economics. When resources tighten, morality rearranges itself quickly. Roy sensed that the system had begun to metabolize him, converting him from participant to liability. Not in a single unified motion, but through dozens of independent calculations layered on top of one another. No dramatic betrayal yet, just preparation. Preparation is always the most ruthless phase. The newspapers still hadn't caught up. Public narratives had not yet aligned with what was happening beneath the surface. The outside world remained unaware that a long-standing structure was in the middle of recalibration. But underground, men moved differently. And when men in hidden systems begin changing how they move, it means they believe the old map no longer works. Roy could feel that belief spreading, that he didn't resist it openly, that he studied it. The turning of tides does not announce itself with violence, that it announces itself with silence, distance, and new alignments that emerge without explanation, and all three had begun. See, once the tide had turned, it did not rush. It pressed forward with quiet certainty, testing every boundary it touched. For Roy DeMeo, this was the stage where the shape of betrayal began to feel real, not as an abstract danger, but as a series of small, undeniable shifts in the behavior of the people around him. The first line to weaken was communication. Calls came later than they used to. Messages were shorter. Information that once traveled quickly now moved in fragments, altered by the time it arrived. Men who had once delivered updates with confidence now spoke with hesitation, choosing their words as if each sentence carried weight beyond its meaning. Roy did not confront them, that he observed. Confrontation creates reactions. Observation creates patterns. And Roy was a master of reading patterns. What he began to see was not a coordinated betrayal, but something more dangerous. Individual survival strategies forming independently of one another. Every man was quietly adjusting his position, trying to reduce personal risk without appearing disloyal. That kind of movement is impossible to stop once it begins. Meetings changed in tone. The edge of bravado that once filled the room had dulled. Conversations circled instead of striking directly. Jokes landed with forced awkwardness. Even shared silence felt different, no longer comfortable, but charged with unspoken calculation. The world around Roy still appeared functional, but beneath that surface the internal rules had begun to erode. When rules erode, power becomes unstable. An unstable power does not announce itself as weakness. It disguises itself as restraint. Roy practiced restraint carefully. He narrowed his operations further. He divided knowledge. He compartmentalized movement. Fewer people knew full plans. Fewer people understood sequences. This had once been his greatest strength. Divide the whole into pieces so that no one sees the entire mechanism. Now, it became a defense against his own organization. But defense has a side effect. It increases distrust. Men began to feel excluded. Exclusion breeds anxiety. Anxiety whispers that loyalty might no longer guarantee safety. That whisper grows louder the longer it goes unanswered. At the same time, law enforcement pressure was beginning to surface in indirect ways. Not arrests, yet. Instead, subpoenas brushed against outer layers. Routine questioning expanded in scope. Financial audits arrived where none had existed before. The perimeter around Roy's world was not shattering. It was shrinking with care. Care is terrifying. Care means the other side believes time favors them. Roy could feel time shifting. He had lived most of his life treating time as something he manipulated through schedules, sequences, coordinated movement. Now time felt like an independent force working against him. Days passed without incident, and that absence carried its own implication. Silence like this does not mean safety. It means preparation is still underway. His internal world grew quieter as well. Fewer dinner conversations. Fewer visitors. Even trusted faces now felt like they were looking past him rather than at him. The sense of being observed had changed shape. From external law enforcement to internal evaluation, Roy was no longer only watched by the outside. He was being weighed by his own side. The unspoken question had arrived. Is he still worth the risk? That question is the beginning of the end for any figure built on fear and usefulness. Because once a man becomes more dangerous than profitable, the balance silently shifts. Roy understood that balance better than anyone. He had enforced it countless times. Now he was living inside its turning, yet he did not plead. He did not attempt emotional appeals. Men like Roy do not survive through persuasion in moments like this. They survive through posture. Through appearing unshakable even when the ground has started to move, he continued to present certainty. But certainty, without the force to back it, becomes theater. Point one evening. After a series of delayed communications and unanswered confirmations, Roy realized something with chilling clarity. He now had to assume that at least one person close to him was speaking to someone on the outside. He did not know who. He did not know how often. He did not know what had been said. But assumption had replaced doubt. That is the point where trust collapses from philosophy into mathematics. Once trust becomes a probability instead of a belief, everything changes. From that moment forward, every interaction carried double meaning. Every reassurance felt reversible. Every promise felt provisional. The structure still stood, but the beams had begun to creak, and structures that creak never collapse all at once. They announced their failure slowly, through distance, through silence, through men who begin to choose themselves over the systems they once served. By the end of this phase, Roy DeMeo was no longer standing at the center of a unified entity. He stood at the crossing of diverging paths, some leading toward the future, others toward disappearance. He could not yet see which path he would be placed upon, but he could feel that the placement was no longer his to decide. By the time the first real breach occurred, it did not arrive as a dramatic confession or a sudden arrest. It arrived as a shift in momentum, a change so subtle that only someone who had lived by control as long as Roy DeMeo would feel it immediately. It was the sensation that something once sealed had begun to leak. For years, Roy's world had depended on a fragile agreement between silence and fear. Silence was maintained because fear enforced it. Fear endured because people believed the system was permanent. The breach began the moment someone, somewhere, quietly decided that the system was no longer permanent. And once permanence disappears, calculation replaces loyalty. Roy sensed it first in the way rumors began to ripple, not loudly, not publicly, but through careful wording and strategic pauses. He heard versions of conversations he had never been part of. He noticed how quickly people denied things before he had even accused them. Defense was arriving before attack. That alone was a signal. The psychological balance had shifted. In the past, men feared what Roy might do if they spoke. Now, some feared what would happen if they stayed silent. When fear splits in two directions, it no longer stabilizes anything. This was the first true breach. The fear that once unified now began to divide. The street-level world felt it before the upper layers. Lower-level associates began shrinking their exposure. Fewer risks, fewer appearances, less unnecessary movement. Some claimed business was slow. Others cited personal reasons. But Roy recognized the pattern. Retreat does not spread unless people believe danger is becoming unavoidable, and unavoidable danger always generates new alliances. Men began speaking to each other without routing through him. Relationships that had once been mediated through Roy quietly reconnected laterally. These new lines of communication were not built on loyalty. They were built on information sharing, the kind that helps people decide when to exit. Roy was still feared, but fear alone no longer held the network static. Inside him, the tension settled into a new form. Not urgency, not panic, but hyper-awareness. His senses sharpened the way they do before a storm. He listened more than he spoke. He watched posture, breathing, timing. He measured delay. He tracked changes that no one else would consider significant. The smallest changes mattered now. A man who used to answer on the second ring now answered on the fifth. A meeting that used to happen weekly now needed rescheduling. A familiar route suddenly felt avoided. Each change was minor. Together, they formed a map, and the map showed the territory of Roy's influence shrinking. He did not lash out at this stage. He understood that power exercised in desperation destroys itself. What he felt was not anger, it was recognition. Recognition that the environment had entered a new phase. A phase where old enforcement tools, intimidation, reputation, history, no longer guaranteed compliance. The system had reached the point where its own survival instincts were beginning to override hierarchy. That is the moment when leadership becomes symbolic instead of functional. Even as these cracks widened, the outside world still remained largely unaware of the internal collapse unfolding. There were no dramatic announcements. No flashing sirens aimed in Roy's direction. To the public, the city looked unchanged. Normal. predictable. But to Roy, the city had begun to feel layered. What could be seen on the surface no longer matched what was happening underneath. And underneath, the first real betrayal was no longer theoretical. It had occurred. Not loudly, not publicly, but decisively. From this moment forward, every assumption Roy made would have to include the possibility that something he said would not remain where he placed it, that a confidence might not rest, that a secret might already belong to someone else. This is what makes the first breach the most dangerous. It doesn't shatter the structure, that it infects it with doubt, and doubt spreads faster than fear ever could. Roy now moved through a world that looked familiar but no longer obeyed the rules he had written. The streets were the same. The buildings stood where they always had. The people still smiled when they saw him, but behind those smiles lived new equations. Equations that no longer placed Roy DeMeo at the center. By the end of this phase, the question was no longer whether someone had spoken. The question was how many. And from that point forward, the outcome was no longer a matter of strength. It was a matter of time. Chapter 8. The trap begins to close. By the time the trap truly began to close around Roy DeMeo, it no longer felt like pressure from one direction. It felt like the environment itself had shifted. Walls that once existed only in theory now felt physical. Not solid enough to see, but solid enough to feel when you moved too far in any direction. This was no longer the phase of suspicion. This was the phase of containment. For years, law enforcement had collected fragments, names without confirmation, stories without witnesses, patterns without endpoints. Now those fragments had begun to align into something unified. The investigation was no longer defensive. It was structured, strategic, quietly confident. The goal was no longer to interrupt activity. The goal was to understand the full architecture before dismantling it. Roy could sense that change without ever seeing the paperwork. He felt it in the subtle tightening of timelines, in how delays started overlapping instead of existing in isolation, in how different branches of pressure that once felt disconnected now moved in coordination. He was no longer reacting to coincidences. He was responding to orchestration. For the first time in decades, Roy realized something deeply unsettling. He had become part of a plan that was not his. Inside his remaining inner circle, the consequences were immediate. Men grew careful to the point of paralysis. Nobody wanted to be first to move or last to leave. Everyone waited for signals that never arrived. Meetings felt like provisional placeholders rather than decisive gatherings. The old decisiveness was gone. The operational environment shifted from aggressive to defensive almost overnight. Movement was no longer about expansion. It was about preservation. Roy cut back everything that drew attention. No excess, no visibility, only maintenance. And yet, maintenance itself began to feel risky. Roy also noticed something else. People were no longer asking him what to do as often as they used to. They were telling him what they were already doing. Small difference, enormous meaning. Initiative had shifted outward. That shift marked the true loss of central control. It is not when men stop obeying that power weakens. It is when they stop needing permission. At home, the tension translated into silence that lasted too long. Even routine habits began to feel exaggerated. Sitting, waiting, listening to background noise without hearing it. Time dragged, not because nothing was happening, but because too much was happening invisibly. Roy had always operated in environments where danger announced itself through escalation. This danger did not escalate. It stabilized. That frightened him more than chaos ever had. He began to recognize that the people closing in on him were no longer improvising. They were executing a design shaped over years. A design that required patience, not speed. Reaction, not aggression. Every move he considered now had to be evaluated not only for impact, but for how it might fit into a structure he could no longer see. This created a unique kind of paralysis. Every action might be safe. Every action might also be confirmation. The streets outside looked familiar, but familiarity no longer brought comfort. Roy felt like he was walking through a replica of a city he had once known. Same buildings, same sounds, different rules. Publicly, he still looked like himself. The reputation of Roy DeMeo had not evaporated. If anything, it lingered like an echo, present, but disconnected from actual power. That disconnect grew wider with each passing week. Full loyalty had become conditional. Conditional loyalty is a countdown you cannot stop once it begins. Roy had once used timing as an offensive tool. Now timing was being used against him. Events unfolded without urgency, without warning, without visible intention. The system closing around him did not need dominance, that IT only needed his world to continue shrinking. And shrink it did. By the end of this phase, Roy DeMeo was no longer a man navigating opportunity and risk. He was a man navigating corridors. Corridors narrow, at only one end. And while the walls had not yet touched, the direction was no longer in question. As the corridors around Roy DeMeo narrowed, the pressure did not scream for attention. It pressed inward with the steady weight of inevitability. This was the phase where the walls became felt rather than imagined, where every choice seemed to carry resistance, where every path forward felt slightly shorter than the one before. This was no longer a pursuit built on chasing footsteps. This was a system applying gravity. Roy began to sense that the environment itself had become organized against him, not through crowds at his door or sudden confrontations, but through restriction. Things that once moved easily now required effort. Arrangements that once happened with a phone call demanded explanations. The ordinary had become inconvenient, and inconvenience is often the first visible symptom of control. Inside his circle, the psychological toll deepened. Men who once spoke freely now guarded their words with surgical precision. Silence filled rooms where confidence used to live. Even the most routine exchanges felt staged. Each sentence weighed for possible downstream consequences. The constant mental calculation exhausted everyone involved, including Roy, that he had spent decades teaching people to live inside fear without showing it. Now he was watching that same discipline turn inward. Everyone was holding something back. No one knew who was still safe to trust with the full truth. The slow suffocation of uncertainty began to reshape his internal rhythm. He measured time differently now. Hours felt longer. Days felt denser. Movement no longer provided distraction, it carried weight. Even waiting was no longer neutral. Waiting now meant not acting in a space that was already shrinking. Roy understood that systems do not collapse all at once. They compress. And compression changes everything inside them. Outside his own immediate world, pressures continued aligning. Investigators were no longer proving isolated acts. They were outlining a structure, roles, patterns, flow. Once structure is established, individuals become replaceable components. And replaceable components are easier to remove. This knowledge settled in Roy's body without needing verification. It lived in his posture, in the way he now stood slightly farther from windows, in the way he now listened through doors before opening them, in the way he paused before speaking, not to choose words, but to decide whether speaking at all was necessary. That he was no longer living inside confidence. He was living inside calculation. At this stage, even allies began to look like friction points. Every relationship carried question marks attached at both ends. Roy was no longer a central command figure operating above the field. He was another variable inside a field that no longer respected hierarchy. It was not that he had become weak. It was that the rules governing strength had changed. Strength had once meant being feared. Now strength meant being unseen. Roy was still feared, but he was no longer unseen. That difference followed him everywhere. Even moments of apparent peace carried distortion. A calm afternoon felt suspicious rather than relaxing. A quiet phone line sounded more ominous than a crowded one. Absence itself had become a message, and absence never delivers good news. For the first time, Roy confronted a realization that had avoided him for years. What he was now facing could not be managed through escalation. Every move toward force would only accelerate the system closing around him. Aggression would no longer create silence. It would generate documentation. The world he once shaped through reputation now operated on records, and records never forget. This changed how he thought about the future, not in terms of survival or escape, but in terms of timing. The question was no longer if the trap would close. It was when the final tightening would begin. That he noticed how often the word soon appeared around him, spoken in tones that sounded casual but carried delay embedded inside them. Soon did not mean opportunity anymore. Soon meant countdown. The city outside continued its normal rhythms. Traffic, storefronts, weather, people living lives untouched by the compression unfolding beneath their feet. To them, Roy DeMeo was still a name that existed mostly as rumor, as distant suggestion.to Roy. The world had become a narrowing chamber, pressure without impact, movement without freedom, silence without safety. And in this phase, the weight-bearing phase, the most dangerous thing was not panic.it was adaptation. Because when a man adapts to confinement, he begins to accept it. Roy did not accept it, but he understood it. And understanding gave him just enough clarity to recognize that what was happening now was no longer reversible through maneuvering. The walls were in place. They were simply waiting to finish their work. By the time the final mechanism began to engage, Roy DeMeo no longer experienced pressure as something external. It had become an internal condition, a constant presence that shaped every thought before it reached action. The trap was no longer just closing around him. It was closing through him. This was the stage where hesitation replaced instinct. For most of his life, Roy had acted first and analyzed afterward. Now every impulse passed through layers of restraint before it ever reached motion. He measured the risk of movement against the danger of stillness. Both felt unsafe. Both felt watched. And when both options feel watched, control becomes an illusion. The investigation that had once moved in fragments now operated with cohesion. Separate lines of inquiry had converged into a single structure. Witness statements overlapped. Patterns synchronized. Timelines reinforced one another. What had once required inference now required only confirmation. Roy did not see the evidence, but he felt its gravity. His environment had changed in ways that no longer required interpretation. The responses he received from people outside his circle had become procedural instead of reactive. No one rushed him. No one argued. No one challenged him aggressively. He was being handled the way systems handle objects they have already categorized. That quiet classification was the most chilling shift of all. Even among the men still closest to him, the behavior had changed. Nobody spoke with urgency anymore. The frantic edge that once accompanied danger had been replaced with a strange, muted patience. It was as if everyone was waiting for something they already expected. Roy was no longer the countdown. He was inside the countdown. He began to notice how often contingency language appeared in conversation. If replaced when. In case replaced after. Plans were phrased no longer as sequences, but as alternatives. This was the language of people who were already imagining outcomes beyond the current structure. Outcomes that did not include continuity. Power had not vanished in a single blow. It had dissolved into probabilities. And probabilities cannot be commanded. They can only be endured. One of the most unsettling realizations Roy confronted during this phase was that the world was no longer reacting to him. It was reacting around him. Events unfolded without reference to his presence. Decisions were made that did not require his approval. Adjustments occurred that no longer needed his acknowledgement. This was the final fracture of authority. He remained a figure. He was no longer the axis. The house itself began to feel different. Rooms that had once felt insulated now felt exposed. Windows seemed larger. Sound carried more sharply. Silence lingered longer. Even familiar objects appeared to have shifted position, as if the environment itself were subtly rearranging around an absence that had not yet occurred. Absence is the blueprint of removal. At night, sleep became shallow. Not because of terror. Terror burns out quickly, but because of anticipation. Anticipation is infinitely renewable. It requires no energy. It feeds itself. Roy's mind operated in long arcs now, scanning forward instead of reacting to the present. He'd stopped asking what the next move should be. He was asking what the last move might look like. This was not panic. This was orientation. The moment when a man realizes that the future ahead of him no longer contains branches, only a line. Not a visible line, a structural one. Externally. Nothing dramatic occurred yet. No confrontation. No announcement. No spectacle. The machinery doing its work had no need for thunder. Every lever was already engaged. Every gear aligned. It was only a matter of when the final pressure would be applied. Roy could feel that moment approaching, not through events, but through absence of deviation. When trajectories stop fluctuating, inevitability has arrived. For the first time in his life, Roy DeMeo existed in a space where intimidation had no leverage, reputation had no insulation, and calculation had no advantage. The system closing around him was not emotional. It did not respond to threat or persuasion. It responded only to completion. And systems built for completion do not pause for demonstration. They proceed, quietly, methodically, without hesitation. By the end of this phase, the trap was no longer forming. It was formed. What remained was not movement, only impact. Chapter 9, The Final Descent. By the time Roy DeMeo entered the final descent, the sensation of being trapped had transformed into something quieter and more absolute. The pressure no longer surged. It settled. It lived in the background like a low, constant hum that never turned off. This was the phase where a man no longer asks how to escape, but how long the narrowing can continue. For the first time in his life, Roy felt the future moving without his consent. He still walked familiar streets, still used the same entrances, still followed the routines carved into his life through decades of repetition. But the meaning of those routines had changed. Where they once signified control, they now signified exposure. Predictability had become vulnerability. That he knew it, and worse, he knew others knew it too. Inside his remaining circle, behavior had shifted yet again. The hesitation was no longer tentative. It had become fixed. Men did not delay because they were unsure anymore. They delayed because they were waiting for resolution, one way or another. Silence was no longer protective. It was preparatory. Roy could feel the emotional temperature drop around him. There was no longer fear in the classic sense. There was distance, a careful spacing that appeared almost respectful on the surface, but underneath it was something else entirely. Reclassification. That he was no longer seen as a center of gravity. He was seen as a variable near the end of its relevance. Even his voice, once enough to pause a room, now traveled through layers of quiet interpretation before producing response. Men listened, but they no longer adjusted instantly. Consideration had replaced reflex. That alone told him where he stood. The laws governing his world had changed, and he had not written the new ones day and night. Reflection returned more often, not as remorse, not as fear, but as narrative review. His mind replayed earlier stages of his life not for emotion, but for structure. He traced cause and consequence backwards through years, as if reverse engineering the mechanism that had finally begun to close. This wasn't emotional processing. It was forensic. He did not ask whether things could have gone differently. He asked where momentum became irreversible. The answer did not arrive as a single decision. It revealed itself as accumulation, small choices that seemed rational in isolation, yet formed a direction when viewed from distance. Roy had always trusted momentum. He had built his life on being the one who set it. Now he was living inside momentum shaped by others. That realization did not crush him. It steadied him. Because a man with no illusions has nothing left to negotiate with himself. Externally, the city felt unchanged. Neon signs still hummed. Traffic still flowed. Weather still followed its rhythms. The public world had not yet synchronized with the private completion unfolding beneath it, but Roy no longer gauged reality through the public. He gauged it through absence. The absence of initiative. The absence of escalation. The absence of unpredictability. Those absences confirmed that the descent had begun. For the first time, he also sensed that removal no longer needed justification. In systems like his, justification is required only when stability still exists. Once equilibrium is broken, necessity replaces permission. Roy had once been the architect of such transitions. Now he was standing inside one. He did not panic. Men who ascend through violence rarely panic when descent begins. Panic is for those who still believe in rescue. Roy believed in outcomes, not salvation. Yet beneath that steel stillness lived something new. Not fear, but recognition. Recognition that his world no longer contained unpredictability as opportunity. Only unpredictability as outcome. The descent does not announce itself as catastrophe. It begins as quiet inevitability, gaining momentum in a direction that no longer needs guidance. Roy could feel that motion now, subtle, continuous, unstoppable. Once inevitability takes hold, it does not rush. It settles. It becomes heavy. Roy DeMeo felt that weight everywhere now, not as fear pressing against his chest, but as a steady pressure in his thoughts. The future no longer felt flexible. It felt set, as if the next chapters of his life had already been written and were simply waiting to be read aloud. What changed most during this phase was not the world around him, but the way he moved through it. He no longer searched for leverage, He no longer tested reactions. He no longer probed for opportunity. Those instincts had carried him for decades. Now they rested and used, like tools that belonged to a different era. Roy had entered a space where action no longer shaped events. It merely responded to them. Inside his circle, conversations grew shorter again, but this time not from tension, rather from finality. There was no more confusion about what might be happening. The ambiguity that once fueled paranoia had burned itself out. What remained was quiet acknowledgement. No one said it outright, but everyone felt the same thing. The direction had been decided. Men who once needed Roy now spoke to him with a kind of measured respect reserved for figures whose influence has already begun to pass into memory. It was not disrespect. It was not defiance. It was distance wrapped in politeness. Distance is the last stage before separation. Roy sensed it during routine interactions. Requests that once carried urgency now felt ceremonial. Information arrived as confirmation rather than instruction. It was as if the system had begun to function on delayed authority, acknowledging his position while quietly moving beyond it. That duality was harder to endure than open opposition. Opposition can be confronted, detachment cannot. At night, he no longer waited for the sound of approach. There was no adrenaline in his listening. He waited instead for something quieter, announcement, not of action, but of final clarification. The moment when ambiguity would evaporate, replaced by certainty, he understood now that the descent had reached a depth where even resistance would only decorate the outcome. The mental shift was subtle but profound. Roy had spent his life enforcing permanence through intimidation. Now he was confronting a permanence that could not be intimidated back. Processes were completing themselves beyond his reach. The outside world still had not fully aligned with this internal conclusion. Newspapers did not yet circle his name daily. No spectacle had announced his fall. To the public eye, he remained a rumor more than a headline. But Roy no longer judged reality by headlines, he judged it by movement without him. Plans that no longer included his approval, decisions made without his presence, timelines unfolding independently of his influence. The isolation that had once been strategic had now become literal. And with isolation came clarity. For the first time, Roy allowed himself to examine the truth he had avoided for years. Not whether he would survive this phase, but whether survival had any meaning left that resembled the life he once controlled. Survival, without authority, felt like a different identity altogether. He was not a man built to exist in historical footnotes. Yet he could feel himself drifting toward one. There is a unique kind of gravity that appears when influence fades. It pulls inward rather than outward. It draws attention back into memory instead of directing action forward into the world. Roy could feel his own presence shrinking into recollection even while he still stood in the present. That realization did not wound his pride, that it restructured it. He had always believed that the world answered to momentum. Now he understood that momentum eventually answers to structure. And structure, once fully formed, does not pause to honor the forces that created it. By the end of this phase, Roy DeMeo no longer existed inside a story of suspense. He existed inside a story of completion. The descent had stopped feeling like movement, that it had become position. By the time Roy DeMeo reached the point of no return, the world around him had grown strangely quiet. Not the kind of quiet that promised safety, but the kind that follows after all decisions have already been made. The noise of uncertainty, which once filled every corner of his life, had faded. What remained was clarity without comfort. This was the moment when waiting stopped being a strategy and became a condition. Roy could sense that events were now unfolding on tracks that could not be diverted by intimidation, negotiation, or timing. For years, he had lived inside a belief that every situation contained pressure points, places where force, leverage, or fear could change direction. Now there were no pressure points left to press. The system no longer flexed, that it moved forward. Men who once gathered information for him now spoke of events as if they were already settled. It's happening, they would say, not with urgency, not with alarm, but with a steady finality that left no room for negotiation. These were not reports of danger, they were acknowledgments of movement. Roy had crossed into a phase where reaction no longer influenced outcome. His presence in any situation now felt symbolic rather than functional. Doors still opened for him. voices still lowered in his presence. But the decisions those gestures once represented had already been relocated elsewhere. This was the final theft of power, not violent. Administrative, he felt it most strongly in moments of choice. The choices he faced no longer shaped larger consequences. They shaped only how he would experience the same ending. Should he move today or tomorrow? Should he speak or remain silent? Should he confront or withdraw? None of these questions changed trajectory. They changed only posture. For a man who had defined himself through decisive motion, this was the most profound separation of all. To still be moving, but no longer moving anything. Time itself adopted a new texture. Days did not rush. They stacked. Each morning felt heavier than the last, not because of fear, but because repetition was now stripped of discovery. Nothing new arrived. Only confirmation. Confirmation that the descent had reached its depth. Night. Roy no longer attempted to calculate escape. Escape implies terrain still exists beyond a boundary. What he faced now was not a boundary. It was a limit. And limits do not offer alternate routes. They define endings. He began to sense, in quiet moments, that the question was no longer how this would end, but how long the ending would take to arrive. The distinction mattered. One invites preparation. The other invites only endurance. The last illusions fell without ceremony. The illusion that loyalty could be commanded. The illusion that fear could still organize behavior. The illusion that waiting might produce reversal. Those beliefs did not shatter violently. They simply dissolved. And with their dissolution, a strange stillness emerged in his thinking. Not peace, not surrender. Something closer to orientation. A mental realignment to a future that had already chosen its shape. Roy DeMeo had always believed that men were erased through action. Now he understood that erasure sometimes begins long before the final act begins, the moment a man no longer alters what is coming. From this point forward, every day would be lived in the shadow of an outcome that no longer required his cooperation. This was the true descent, not into chaos, but into inevitability. Chapter 10, The Reckoning begins. The reckoning did not arrive with sirens. It arrived with alignment. After months of pressure that moved like weather, felt everywhere, seen nowhere, the outside world finally began to intersect with Roy DeMeo's private descent. The invisible currents that had shaped his isolation now reached a point where movement became measurable. Not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. This was the moment when consequences stepped out of theory and into sequence. The earliest signs were procedural. Paperwork moved where it hadn't before. Requests for information arrived with increasing regularity. Law enforcement presence did not suddenly spike, it redistributed. The difference mattered. When attention concentrates, it threatens. When it organizes, it concludes. Roy could feel organization settling into place. For the first time in years, time worked against him in visible ways. Delays that once provided insulation now amplified risk. A postponed meeting no longer bought safety. It created space for others to move without him. Every hour he remained stationary was an hour in which external machinery advanced. He was no longer ahead of the clock, that he was inside it. People he had not spoken to in months suddenly resurfaced, not with offers, not with threats, but with neutral inquiries. Polite, procedural. Their tone communicated not fear, but positioning. And positioning meant that decisions had already been made upstream. Roy recognized the pattern. This was the phase where results begin to collect. Inside his circle, the remaining loyalty thinned again, not in numbers, but in depth. Those who remained near him now behaved like men standing beside a fire that was no longer controllable. They did not flee. They did not interfere. They waited. Waiting had become the universal posture. Roy's internal state shifted subtly during this period. What had once been anticipation became tracking. He no longer scanned forward for abstract outcomes. He measured distance between known points. He distinguished between movement meant for him and movement that merely passed near him. Every step by someone else had a potential vector. Now that he understood that reckoning does not erupt fully formed as symbols, the city outside continued its routines. Markets opened and closed. Trains ran on schedules. Weather moved across boroughs indifferent to the quiet machinery assembling beneath it all. To the public, nothing felt imminent. Roy. The shape of imminence had sharpened. Even fear had changed texture. It no longer came as spikes. It existed as a steady compression of awareness, a pressure that no longer inspired reaction but demanded endurance. He lived now in measured increments of patience, not the patience of strategy, the patience of inevitability. He also recognized that narratives were beginning to form without him. Conversations he was not part of were shaping interpretations he could not influence. Evidence was no longer being interpreted in isolation. It was being arranged into coherent story. Once a coherent story exists, momentum shifts from discovery to confirmation. And confirmation is not a discussion. The most unsettling shift of all was how quietly this phase unfolded. No confrontation, no warning, no negotiation. The reckoning advanced not as a predator, but as a process. Processes do not feel anger. They do not hurry. They do not argue. They conclude. Roy had once used processes to erase others without spectacle. Now he lived within one himself, structured, paced, irreversible. The waiting had changed form again. Now it wasn't waiting for something unknown. It was waiting for the world to acknowledge what had already been decided. The first movements of exposure never feel like exposure at all. They feel like coincidence. A door that used to stay closed is suddenly open. A name that once stayed buried appears in the wrong place. A detail long ignored begins to repeat itself too often to remain accidental. For Roy DeMeo, this was the phase where the outside world began to brush against his private reality. Not forcefully, not decisively, but often enough to leave fingerprints. He started hearing familiar names spoken in unfamiliar contexts. Not as rumors passed in whispers, but as references woven into official language. These weren't accusations. They were acknowledgments. Subtle nods that certain connections were no longer invisible. This kind of attention was different. That it did not carry threat. That it carried definition. For a man who had lived inside ambiguity as a shield, definition was the most dangerous condition of all. The environment around him grew more structured by the day. Patterns became easier to detect. The randomness that once allowed Roy to hide inside noise was being slowly stripped away. Even silence now felt cataloged, and when silence becomes measurable, exposure is already underway. That he noticed it in the way people outside his immediate world addressed him. Their formality sharpened. Their warmth pulled back into professionalism. Even casual exchanges now carried borders. He was no longer treated as an undefined figure. He was being classified. Classification is the step before action. Inside his remaining circle, the tension shifted again. The people who stood closest to him now moved with visible care, not only for their safety, but for appearances. Being seen near him began to feel like liability rather than protection. That change cut deeper than any threat ever had. Roy did not respond with anger. He responded with awareness. He knew exactly what was happening. This was not yet confrontation. It was placement. Authorities do not rush to remove powerful figures. They reposition them inside a framework where removal becomes a matter of timing rather than struggle. Roy was being placed. He could feel the frame forming around him at the same time. Elements of the past began to resurface in indirect ways. Old associations reappeared in records. Earlier events were re-examined from new angles. What once existed as fragments scattered across years was now being pulled into alignment. The past was no longer distant. It was being summoned. This realization changed how Roy experienced memory. What had once been sealed as history now felt active again, no longer behind him, but moving toward him through other hands. The narrative he had constructed around himself was thinning, thread by thread. For the first time in years, Roy felt genuinely outpaced, not physically. Structurally, he was no longer the fastest-moving element in his environment. The investigation no longer responded to him. It anticipated him, not through prediction of choice, but through elimination of alternatives. Every direction now ended in observation. The people closest to him sensed this too. Their eyes no longer searched his face for instruction. They searched it for signal. Signal of what was coming. Signal of whether escape was possible. Signal of whether alignment with him still made sense. Roy had become a weather event rather than a navigator. You don't follow storms. You decide where to shelter. That shift was unmistakable. There were moments now when Roy caught himself thinking in terms he had never allowed before. Not about control, not about influence, but about legacy. Not as glorification, as accounting. What would remain? how events would be interpreted once the dust settled. Legacy is not something men of his world usually contemplate. It belongs to the aftermath, and realizing that you are approaching aftermath means you have crossed out of the present without ever leaving it. Externally, exposure remained partial. No grand announcements. No visible collapse. The public face of his world still stood upright. But underneath, supports were being quietly removed. The reckoning was no longer a shadow. It had begun its first visible steps, and Roy, for the first time, could measure the approach not by fear, but by distance remaining. Consequence rarely arrives as impact. It arrives as weight. For Roy DeMeo, the weight became noticeable in the smallest places, where options used to exist and now did not. Where hesitation once felt optional and now felt permanent. It wasn't that everything had changed. It was that nothing could change anymore without being observed. The world around him had narrowed. Not in size. In permission. There were things he no longer did. Not because he feared immediate retaliation, but because each action now carried a measurable echo. No movement ended when it ended. Everything extended outward into records, into memory, into systems designed to outlast resistance. Roy had lived most of his life believing that presence itself created immunity. That being known meant being protected. That influence bent consequence rather than attracting it. But the atmosphere had shifted. Now, presence attracted gravity. People who once moved freely around him now moved in patterns that avoided permanence. Conversations shortened. Meetings became surfaces, nothing discussed that could not safely dissolve. Even loyalties felt temporary now, designed for retreat instead of defense. Roy noticed how often people checked time in his presence. That was new. Checking time is not about schedule. It is about escape routes. He also noticed how often names were avoided. Familiar words disappeared from conversation like forbidden objects. It wasn't fear of saying them. It was fear of attaching to anything that could be traced. This was what consequence looked like before it became visible. It reshaped behavior long before it reshaped reality. Privately, Roy began organizing his life around containment rather than expansion. Where once he thought in terms of growth, network, reach, now his thinking turned inward. Preservation, compression, minimization. That he stopped extending, that he started guarding. That alone marked the end of the era he had built. There were nights now when memory came uninvited. Not nostalgia, inventory. A replay of moments that had once felt trivial, now resurfacing as reference points in a timeline no longer under his control. Roy understood something most people never experience. Once a story becomes external, it no longer belongs to its subject. It belongs to whoever studies it. And his story had officially left his possession. The investigation around him, still formally distant, still undeclared, had crossed into a new phase. This was no longer about whether movement occurred. It was about when structure would finalize. Roy sensed the architecture forming around his life. It was a sensation not of danger, but of enclosure. The future was no longer wide. It had angles, and angles create corners. There is a strange calm that sometimes comes at this stage. Not peace, but clarity. No illusions remain to argue with. No uncertainty left to interpret as safety. Only trajectory. Roy became quieter, not withdrawn. Focused, he measured conversations before entering them. He listened twice before speaking once. His presence grew more controlled. His expressions restrained not by fear, but by calculation that no longer relied on bravado. This was a different kind of survival mode. Not active defense, passive endurance. And yet, beneath even that, he understood what endurance truly meant now. Not avoiding collapse, but determining how collapse would occur. Would it be sudden? Would it be extended? Would it be public? Or invisible until it was no longer avoidable? These were no longer theoretical questions. They were logistical ones. Roy DeMeo had once moved through the world like a force the environment bent around. Now the environment had stabilized, and forces do not bend stable systems. They fracture within them. What remained uncertain was not if the fracture would come, only where it would begin. Chapter 11. The walls begin to speak. There comes a moment in every long-running hidden world when silence stops being protection and starts becoming evidence. For Roy DeMeo, that moment did not arrive with sirens, headlines, or confrontation. It arrived quietly, through patterns, through gaps, through the subtle change in how information moved around him. The walls, as it were, had begun to speak, not out loud, not openly, but through absence. Where there had once been rumors floating endlessly through back channels, there was now restraint. Where gossip once traveled freely, it now stalled. The underground had learned a new language, one built not on noise, but on omission, and omission is never accidental. Roy began to notice that he was learning things later than he used to, sometimes much later. Deals already underway, arrangements already shifting, names being repositioned without his knowledge. He was not being excluded aggressively. He was being bypassed quietly. That distinction mattered. Exclusion would have been emotional. Bypassing was mathematical. It meant decisions were no longer waiting for his presence. That alone revealed the most significant change of all. The environment had begun preparing for a version of itself where Roy was no longer central to the equation. This was not yet removal. It was reconfiguration. And reconfiguration always precedes collapse. Roy understood organizational behavior better than most men ever would. He knew that no structure dismantles itself suddenly. First, it adapts. It tests the absence of a component. It reroutes pathways. It simulates continuation without what it once relied upon. That process had begun, not loudly but efficiently. At the same time, pressure from the outside world had grown heavier, though still formally unseen. Systems moved differently around him now. Places that once felt neutral developed friction. Interactions with ordinary institutions, banks, licensing offices, property management, regulatory bodies, became slower, colder, more procedural. Nothing illegal had been said. Nothing accusatory had been stated, but everything had become documented. Roy felt it in the way questions were asked, in the way forms were processed, in the number of times he was asked to confirm information that had already been confirmed before. These were not accusations. They were checkpoints. And checkpoints mean controlled movement. In his earlier years, Roy had thrived on adaptability. The shifting of rules did not threaten him because he had power over how rules were interpreted. But adaptation requires space, and that space was narrowing. Now, the rules were no longer bending around him. They were enclosing him. Privately, Roy began to reconsider every decision that involved exposure. Who truly needed to see him? Who truly needed to speak to him in person? Which relationships still functioned as assets, and which had transformed into liabilities disguised as loyalty? He began cutting contact not emotionally, but procedurally, distance by policy, accessibility by design. This was not isolation. It was strategic invisibility, but invisibility only works when no one is specifically looking, and Roy sensed, with growing certainty, that attention had already been fixed. The feeling was not paranoia. It was pattern recognition. The same instinct that had once helped him navigate risk now told him that the environment had shifted from observation to preparation. The difference between those two is everything. Observation collects. Preparation acts. Roy adjusted his posture accordingly. His movements became even more constrained. The circle of those allowed near him tightened. Even long-time associations felt the change without necessarily understanding it. It wasn't that Roy pushed people away, he simply stopped pulling them closer. This created tension. Tension creates signal, and signal attracts scrutiny. He knew the paradox well. The very methods used to protect oneself in late-stage exposure often generate the final layer of suspicion that confirms the need for action. Roy now lived inside that paradox. There were nights when sleep came easily, not because the danger had passed, but because the unknown had condensed. Uncertainty is exhausting. Certainty, of any kind, can be strangely calming. And Roy was becoming certain of one truth above all others. Whatever ending awaited him, it would not be sudden. It would be constructed. A net does not announce itself when it closes. It does not rush. It does not chase. It simply adjusts, slowly, patiently, until the space inside it becomes smaller than the space outside it. Roy DeMeo felt that shift without ever seeing a single thread. First, it appeared as inconvenience. Delays that were unusual, but not alarming. Transactions that once moved fluidly now paused for review. Access that had always been assumed now required confirmation. These were not warnings. They were conditions that a new layer had been added between him and the world. He began to notice how many systems now required identity instead of reputation. Where his name once opened doors, now his identification was required to even approach them. Paperwork had replaced familiarity. Verification had replaced trust. The environment had stopped recognizing him as a force that IT had begun recognizing him as a variable. This was the most dangerous stage for a man like Roy. When the invisible systems start converting influence into data, data does not fear reputation. Data only accumulates. In conversations, he sensed a shift in tone. People who once spoke freely now chose words carefully. Statements were phrased with distance. Opinions were offered as hypotheticals instead of beliefs. He saw the language of legal insulation begin to creep into ordinary dialogue. People were protecting themselves before they needed to. That alone meant they anticipated needing to. Roy's mind worked constantly now, not to expand his world, but to understand the limits being formed around it. He replayed recent years not emotionally, but structurally, tracking moments where lines might have bent into records. He knew how investigations truly worked, rarely through direct confrontation, almost always through accumulation. One record alone means nothing, but patterns do not lie, and Roy sensed that a pattern had already reached critical mass, still unseen, still unnamed, but heavy enough to distort everything that moved near it. Every choice now required double calculation, not just what it achieved, but how it would look later. He became acutely aware of time, not in terms of schedules, but in terms of sequence. Which actions could still occur safely before others closed off entirely? Which movements were still normal enough to pass unnoticed? Which presences were becoming explainable only once? Roy had crossed into a phase where every action spent a resource that could not be replenished. Normalcy. Once normalcy is gone, everything becomes event. This stage of pressure is especially brutal because it denies confrontation. There is no enemy to face, no accusation to argue, no visible opponent to neutralize. Only tension that thickens with every passing hour, and tension is exhausting. Even for someone built on endurance, Roy began preparing for possibilities he had once dismissed as implausible. Legal containment, long-term exposure, structural exile, outcomes that did not involve suddenness, but permanence. He recognized the difference now between escape and evasion. Escape requires opportunity. Evasion requires endurance, and endurance only lasts as long as the environment allows it to. The outside world still looked the same. Streets were full. Businesses ran. Days unfolded with ordinary rhythm. But Roy experienced reality differently now, not as sequence, but as countdown. Not toward an event he could define, but toward a point of no return. He did not know what would happen, but he now understood what was no longer possible. The net had not closed, but its perimeter had become undeniable, and every step he took inside it made the space smaller. Silence had always been Roy DeMeo's ally. In the world he helped shape, silence was not emptiness, it was agreement. It was protection. It was the space where things survived without needing to be spoken. For decades, silence had guarded names, softened edges, buried stories before they ever rose far enough to become real. But now, silence had changed its meaning. Now, it did not conceal that IT accumulated. Roy began to understand, with a clarity that was almost clinical, that the absence of noise was no longer safety. It had become a record of restraint. The quiet around him was not loyalty, it was distancing. It was people learning how to exist without saying his name. And when a name stops being said, it does not disappear. It begins being stored. This was the phase no one ever prepares for, the time when nothing happens, and that nothing slowly becomes the most dangerous thing of all. No questions, but also no reassurance. No confrontation, but also no protection. Only time, stretching forward, filling itself with detail. Roy could feel it in the way people declined to remember things. Conversations that once would have included stories now shifted toward neutral ground. Memories were suddenly unreliable. Familiar events became vague. Even shared experiences were framed as coincidences instead of connections. That wasn't denial. It was insulation. Roy understood the logic. When silence becomes testimony, self-preservation demands that people forget in specific, selective ways. Forgetting becomes a strategy. Ambiguity becomes a shield. But ambiguity cannot protect everyone. Someone must remain fixed at the center of the story. That someone was still him. At this stage, Roy's presence no longer triggered reactions of fear or respect. It triggered something quieter, and far more final: calculation. People no longer asked themselves what Roy could do. They asked what his existence might eventually cost them. That question changes everything. Roy felt the weight of this shift even in routine moments. Invitations grew rare. Neutral settings replaced familiar meeting points. Encounters became transactional, stripped of warmth and expectation. The world had not turned against him. It had turned away. This kind of abandonment is especially cruel because it offers no resistance to fight, no force to push against, just absence where connection once lived. Roy became acutely aware that his past, once a reservoir of leverage, was now a source of danger for anyone standing too close to it. And so, they stepped back. Even among the few who still showed loyalty, something had changed in how it was expressed. Their support was quieter, more careful. Favors came with disclaimers. Help came with expectations of distance afterward. No one wanted to be seen doing too much for him anymore. Visibility had become radioactive. Roy did not respond with anger. He responded with containment. He reduced his footprint, simplified his routines, limited physical exposure. Where he had once moved with authority, he now moved with measured neutrality, not hiding, but refusing to attract reflection. This was not surrender. It was the final discipline of someone who understands that visibility is no longer power, but discipline cannot reverse momentum. Why now? Roy's situation had entered a phase governed not by chance, but by structure. Forces larger than individuals were now shaping the outcome. Institutions, archives, records that did not care about fear or reputation. Records do not hesitate. They only grow. Roy understood, with a precision that chilled even him, that his world had transitioned from story to file. And files do not close themselves. He was no longer living within events. He was living inside documentation. Every unsaid word now had weight because it joined millions of others in places where silence doesn't vanish. It waits. This was the moment when Roy accepted the truth he had resisted. Whatever ending awaited him, it would not be chosen by force. It would be chosen by accumulation, slow, methodical, unstoppable. And there was nothing louder than the silence that now followed him everywhere. Chapter 12. The day the future became finite. There are moments in a person's life that don't announce themselves with impact. No thunder, no sudden collapse, just a quiet internal shift, subtle enough to be missed by everyone except the person experiencing it. For Roy DeMeo, this was the day his future stopped feeling open-ended. Nothing dramatic happened that morning. No sirens cut the air. No headlines carried his name. No voice delivered a warning. The city moved as it always had. People rushed to work. Doors opened and closed. Traffic stacked and released in familiar waves. From the outside, everything appeared unchanged. But internally, something had narrowed. Roy woke with a sense that the range of possible outcomes had tightened. Not emotionally, structurally. The kind of realization that doesn't feel like fear, but like mathematics. A quiet understanding that the path ahead no longer branched outward. It pointed in fewer directions now. For most of his life, Roy had operated inside a world that felt expandable. Even when pressure existed, he believed there were always multiple exits. Some visible, some hidden, some that only revealed themselves under stress. That belief had sustained him through risk after risk. Now, that belief had faded. He went through his routine with deliberate normalcy. Ate slowly, moved with control, listened to the rhythm of the city as though it were a language he had spoken all his life. Outwardly, nothing in his behavior suggested a man confronting limitation. Inwardly, every movement carried the understanding that options were no longer growing. They were closing. Roy had long understood that power is not defined by what you can do. It is defined by what you can still avoid. And that morning, the number of things he could still avoid had decreased. He could feel it in conversations that no longer returned, in favors that were no longer offered, in the quiet reorganization of the environment around him, a reorganization that did not require his knowledge or consent. The world was proceeding with a version of reality in which his long-term presence was no longer assumed. This was not exile. It was preparation. Roy did what he had always done when confronted with structural uncertainty. He observed patterns, not emotionally, not defensively, clinically. He examined timelines. Who he had seen recently, who had delayed contact, which places felt altered, which routines now felt measured rather than natural. Patterns told him what people would not. The pattern said this. The distance between surveillance and action had shortened. He had lived for years knowing that attention existed. It always had. But attention alone does not define a turning point. What defines it is when attention becomes organized. When scattered observation transforms into coordinated focus. This was that phase. What disturbed Roy most was not danger. It was predictability. He had always mastered chaos. Unpredictable environments favored him. But structure did not. Structure removes creativity from survival. It replaces instinct with protocol. And protocol does not debate that as the day continued, subtle confirmations layered over one another. A conversation that ended too quickly. A routine matter that required unnecessary verification. A delay where none had ever existed. No individual moment meant anything alone. Together, they formed a sequence that could not be ignored. Roy felt the weight of timing. This was no longer a matter of if, only of when. Yet even in this realization, he maintained control over one thing that had always defined him, his composure. Panic would change nothing. Reaction would only accelerate momentum. He did not lash out. He did not retreat fully. He adjusted his presence into a narrower shape, not hiding, conserving. For the first time in his life, Roy began thinking not in terms of long-term strategy, but in terms of short-term endurance. How long could normalcy be sustained? How long could ambiguity delay certainty? How long could the system continue preparing without executing? These were questions without verbal answers. Only observations could respond. As evening approached, he felt the strangest sensation of all, not dread, not fear, not regret, but finality. A quiet psychic sensation that the architecture of his life had reached its last phase of construction. The foundation had already been laid. The walls had gone up. All that remained was the moment when the door would be closed. Not violently, not suddenly, decisively. Roy DeMeo did not yet know the exact shape this ending would take, but he now understood something with perfect clarity. The future no longer belonged to possibility, it belonged to sequence. And sequence, once fixed, does not wait. Machinery does not ask, that it does not negotiate, it does not explain itself, that it simply begins to move. Roy DeMeo did not hear it start. There was no sound to mark the shift. No visible signal that the invisible systems around him had crossed from monitoring into motion. But he felt it. In the subtle acceleration of everything that once moved slowly. The first sensation was timing. Things began happening out of sequence. Events that should have followed weeks behind now occurred within days. Processes that once dragged now compressed. The long, patient rhythm of delay had been replaced by efficiency. Efficiency is not rushed, that it is intentional. Roy noticed that responses to routine actions arrived faster than expected. Information returned sooner. Barriers formed where corridors once existed. The environment was no longer flexible. It had become procedural. This was not pressure from individuals. This was pressure from systems. And systems do not bargain. Roy had always understood that danger rarely announces itself in its most lethal form. It first appears as convenience, as speed, as sudden clarity. It simplifies the world until choices feel irrelevant because paths are already chosen. He now sensed that simplification taking place. The margins were disappearing, where once he could maneuver through gray space, neither fully safe nor fully exposed. That gray had begun to drain away. What remained was contrast, defined boundaries, known zones, everything categorized. Roy lingered inside that shrinking center. The most unsettling part was how calm it all felt. Not quiet in the sense of peace, but quiet in the sense of inevitability. The kind of quiet that exists inside sealed rooms. Nothing breaks it because nothing needs to. Even his own thoughts began to feel organized, as though his mind had subconsciously accepted the architecture forming around his life. He no longer imagined how events might unfold in multiple directions. His thinking had collapsed into linear sequence. Step follows step. He became acutely aware that his decisions no longer changed the destination. They only influenced the route. This realization unsettled him more than any threat ever could. Late one evening, the sensation sharpened. There was no single interaction that caused it. No conversation that confirmed what he already suspected. It was the absence of friction that did it. Movement without resistance. The feeling of being carried forward by something that no longer needed his participation. The machinery had reached operational momentum that IT was not surrounding him. IT was including him. Roy began preparing for the degradation that always follows this stage, not the collapse, but the interpretation. When narratives form around a person independent of their control, when other people begin explaining who you are, what you did, what you meant, interpretation is the death of autonomy. That he still possessed physical freedom, but narrative freedom was already slipping away. The world was preparing to define him. Roy felt a strange dual awareness begin to form. One part of him still lived in the present, moving, observing, existing inside daily rhythm. Another part of him now lived afterward, imagining how everything would be described, reconstructed, reorganized without him. That second awareness is the one most people never experience. That IT is the awareness of being posthumous before death. He had crossed into a stage where the meaning of his actions would soon belong to others, and they would not require his permission. That he no longer attempted to outmaneuver the system directly. Instead, he studied it, not to escape it, but to understand what remained possible inside it. Once you understand the size of the container, you can at least choose how you inhabit it. Privacy had become his last remaining territory. Even that felt borrowed. Nothing about this phase resembled panic. Panic belongs to people who still believe interruption can change outcome. Roy no longer believed that. What he felt instead was the quiet gravity of inevitability. Gravity does not rush, it only pulls. Each day now carried that pull beneath its surface. Conversations still occurred. Life still moved. Ordinary moments still unfolded. But beneath all of it, gravity held everything in alignment with something no longer optional. The future was not approaching him like a wave. It was already beneath his feet, and every step now took place on ground that was being slowly and precisely measured. There is a moment in every long struggle when resistance stops being a practical action and becomes a philosophical idea. For Roy DeMeo, that moment arrived quietly, without confrontation, without warning, without anything that could be pointed to as the turning point. It arrived as a slow internal conclusion. That resistance, as he once understood it, no longer had a stage on which to perform. The mechanics of opposition had changed. In the past, resistance meant action, movement, counterweight, leverage. It meant identifying pressure and pushing back with equal or greater force. But what surrounded him now could not be pushed. There was no single opponent to confront, no clear structure to attack, no pressure point that could be exploited. The system had dispersed itself. IT existed everywhere and nowhere at once. Roy began to see that resistance had become conceptual rather than physical. He could still move, still speak, still decide, but none of those actions altered the architecture forming around him. At best, they altered timing. At worst, they provided additional material for interpretation. Opposition now generated consequence instead of relief. This realization created a profound shift in how Roy viewed his own strength. For most of his life, strength had been external, measured in influence, in the movement of others, in the visible shaping of environments. Now, strength had become internal, measured not by what he could change, but by how calmly he could remain unchanged inside forces he could no longer redirect. That is a different kind of endurance. It provides no validation, only survival. Roy became hyper-aware of how performance itself can become an illusion once outcomes are no longer elastic. He could still perform authority, still project certainty, still follow ritual and routine. But those performances no longer shaped consequence. They simply layered meaning over a structure that no longer cared. It was not that resistance had failed. It was that resistance had become irrelevant. This realization did not break him. It clarified him. He stopped thinking in terms of prevention. He began thinking in terms of placement. If he could not stop what was coming, he could at least influence how it would unfold in form rather than in outcome. There is a strange dignity in that shift, choosing posture when direction is no longer yours to choose. The world around him continued as though none of this existed. People still laughed in public spaces. Arguments still occurred over trivial matters. Ordinary life maintained its illusions of control. Roy moved among these illusions while privately aware that illusion had left his own life entirely. There is a loneliness in that awareness that cannot be shared. Language fails at this stage. How do you explain to someone that the future has already been written, just not yet revealed? That time is no longer a question mark, but a countdown without numbers? People would mistake that understanding for despair.it was not despair.it was precision. Roy began reducing complexity wherever it remained within his reach. Simplifying conversations, simplifying movement, simplifying presence. Not because he feared chaos, but because chaos no longer served him. Noise creates distortion. Distortion invites misinterpretation. At this stage, misinterpretation was dangerous. He had learned that silence no longer protected him. Now he learned that clarity was the last thing he still controlled. Even so, clarity did not produce safety.it, only produced clean edges. And clean edges make the fall visible. Why now? Roy no longer imagined escape. Even as theory, it felt structurally impossible. Not because barriers were visible, but because opportunities no longer existed in unguarded form. Escape requires unsupervised space. There was none left. The environment had achieved containment not through physical boundaries, but through total overlap. Every space was adjacent to structure. Every movement intersected with record. Every presence intersected with memory. To resist this would require invisibility, true invisibility, and that illusion had already been dismantled. Roy felt something strange begin to replace the instinct to resist, not acceptance, not surrender, not indifference, but alignment. Not with the outcome, but with the logic of sequence. He no longer fought the current. He studied it. Where will it narrow? Where will it deepen? Where will it surface? These were no longer questions of escape. They were questions of navigation within inevitability. In the quiet hours, when thought has room to stretch without interruption, Roy sometimes reflected not on actions taken, but on timing lost. Not on mistakes, but on moments when motion had outpaced restraint. When structures were built too quickly. When power expanded faster than concealment. Timing is the only resource that never regenerates. And Roy now understood that his timing had already been spent. The future had not closed because of a single moment. It had closed because of accumulation. This was the truth that could no longer be ignored. The world no longer waited to see what Roy would do next. It had already decided what would happen to him. And the only thing still uncertain was how long the unveiling would take. Chapter 13. The first public line is crossed. The first public line is never loud. It does not arrive with spectacle. It does not announce itself with finality. It arrives as a shift in atmosphere, so subtle that only those living inside it truly recognize what has changed. For Roy DeMeo, that shift came not through confrontation, but through exposure. Up until now, his world had been governed by implication, by quiet awareness, by invisible preparation. Whatever forces were moving around him still lived mostly in the background, structured, procedural, deliberate. But this was the moment when the background began to bleed into the surface of public reality. And when that happens, containment transforms into confirmation. Roy became aware of the shift through indirect signals. Names that once circulated only in closed spaces began appearing in places where language is permanent. Conversations that once dissolved into privacy began appearing in environments built for memory. The distance between private understanding and public visibility had narrowed. That distance had once protected him. Now it no longer existed. This is the precise moment when a man's life divides into two timelines. Before the narrative becomes external, after the narrative no longer belongs to him. Roy found himself arriving in that second timeline without ceremony. The first public line is rarely crossed with an announcement. It's crossed when the world around you begins behaving as though it already knows something it has not yet said out loud. People respond differently. Institutions behave differently. Systems change their tempo. And although no one confronts you directly, everything begins interacting with you as though confrontation is now inevitable. This phase is uniquely disorienting because visibility does not arrive all at once. It arrives in fragments, each one small enough to be dismissed on its own, but heavy when felt together. A reference made too casually, a silence held too long, a procedural delay that feels less like caution and more like preservation. Roy felt all of it. This was not panic. This was recognition. He understood now that the world had quietly agreed to transition him from subject of rumor to object of record. Once that shift occurs, there is no reversal. Rumor is fluid. Record is permanent. And permanence does not require belief to be dangerous. It only requires preservation. Roy moved more carefully now, not because he feared observation, but because observation no longer needed to search for him. He had become referenceable. His presence could now be verified within systems that did not rely on human discretion. This is the moment when fate stops feeling abstract. This is the moment when timing becomes visible instead of theoretical. There is a peculiar psychological effect that occurs during early public exposure. It is not dread, it is density. The world does not collapse around you. Instead, it thickens. Every interaction feels slower, heavier, more intentional. Even normal exchanges carry a residue of meaning that did not exist before. Roy felt that density wherever he moved. He was no longer just present, he was observed memory. And memory, once externalized, cannot be corrected at this stage. Roy no longer thought in terms of defending his name. He knew that names, once external, evolve independently of their source. He no longer attempted to control interpretation. That battle had already been lost the moment interpretation began without him in the room. Instead, he focused on controlling structure, how days unfolded, how accessibility was managed, how exposure was limited to only what was unavoidable. But structure, too, was now partially external. The environment had begun participating, and environments do not negotiate. The deeper truth of this chapter is that the first public line is not where everything changes to it, is where everything becomes irreversible. Before this point, retreat is possible. After this point, only transition remains. Roy had now entered the stage of transition. He could feel it not as fear, but as the strange compression of time. The future no longer stretched outward. It folded inward, gathering itself into fewer shapes, fewer outcomes, fewer possibilities. Even without explicit declaration, something had been crossed at a threshold. Roy did not yet know how visible it would become, but he knew with certainty that his life had now entered a phase that could no longer be undone, only completed. Once a story leaves its source, it does not remain unanswered for long. The world has a reflex, an instinct to complete unfinished narratives. Gaps invite certainty. Ambiguity invites filling. And when enough fragments exist in public space, interpretation no longer waits for permission. It begins assembling its own conclusion. For Roy DeMeo, this was the stage where the world began crafting its answer, not to any question formally asked, but to the unease that had been quietly growing around his name at first. The answer took the shape of subtle repetition. Certain ideas appeared more often in conversation. Familiar references surfaced in unrelated discussions. The same concerns, framed in different ways, began echoing across separate spaces: social, institutional, procedural. None of these echoes were loud, but together they created resonance. Resonance is how narratives stabilize. Roy could feel that stabilization taking place. The uncertainty around him had not disappeared, it had condensed. People were no longer asking vague questions. They were silently aligning around shared assumptions. The world had not declared its judgment yet, but it was rehearsing this phase. Power shifts in a quiet but decisive way. Individuals stop asking what might be true and begin asking what should be done if it is. That shift does not require proof. It requires alignment. And alignment, once achieved, is stronger than doubt. Roy noticed this alignment not through hostility, but through coordination. Actions in one area began anticipating reactions in another. Procedures connected with conversation. Movement in one space triggered adjustment in others. This was not chaos that was choreographed, and no single person appeared to be directing it. That's what made it effective. When systems move without needing a visible architect, resistance becomes complicated. There is no one to argue with, no one to persuade, no room to interrupt with explanation. The world had begun answering him without addressing him. For a man whose life had been built on negotiation, this was deeply disorienting. Negation requires two sides. Alignment removes the need for dialogue. Once consensus begins forming without you, you are no longer a participant. You are a subject. Roy sensed that his own voice now carried less weight in shaping how others interpreted him. Even when he spoke, meaning traveled differently. His words no longer shaped conclusions. They were filtered through a process already in motion. This is the moment when truth becomes secondary to structure. It is also the moment when presence transforms into symbol. Roy began to feel the first edges of that transformation. Not as celebrity, not as notoriety, but as abstraction, as the idea of him began to matter more than the person. When that happens, outcomes detach from individual behavior. One becomes an example rather than an actor. Examples do not get to influence their own meaning. They are used. The most unsettling realization Roy experienced during this phase was that defense no longer functioned in a traditional way. Defense relies on clarification, explanation, counter-narrative. But counter-narratives require an audience that still seeks alternatives. The audience had already chosen coherence, and coherence prefers simplicity. Roy understood that whatever future awaited him would not depend solely on actions taken from this point forward. Those actions would be interpreted through a lens already configured. Every movement would now be added to a story that no longer required his consent, that he became acutely aware of how fragile meaning becomes once it stops being personal. He had lived a life where meaning was negotiated, managed, shifted as needed. Now meaning was being externalized, standardized, assigned. There is a quiet terror in that realization, not because the outcome is known, but because the framework no longer belongs to you. Roy adjusted again, not by fighting the narrative, not by feeding it, but by executing precision in every remaining moment of agency. If the story would be written regardless, then at least its details could not be sloppy. At least his movements would not supply unnecessary distortion. This was not image management. It was structural discipline that he knew now that the world had stopped asking whether he would fall. It had begun asking how. And once the world begins asking how, the only remaining unknown is timing. Everything else becomes function. Roy lived now inside that function. Each day unfolded as both present action and future artifact. The echo of his life now reached forward faster than his footsteps, and the world, patient, interpretive, relentless, continued assembling its answer. Inevitability does not arrive as a single step. It arrives as a posture. For Roy DeMeo, that posture settled in quietly, through the way days now arranged themselves without requiring his input. Morning led to afternoon. Afternoon folded into evening. And each transition occurred with the same unspoken understanding. The direction of things no longer bent around him. This was not surrender. This was recognition. There is a difference. Surrender implies choice. Recognition implies observation. Roy had crossed from one into the other. He no longer wondered whether momentum might reverse. The question had refined itself into something colder and more precise. How momentum would be allowed to complete itself. His attention turned toward the mechanics of sequence rather than its outcome. He understood now that he was inside a progression that would not be interrupted by emotion, argument, or appeal. It would be guided by alignment. The world had finished forming its answer. Now it simply needed to enact it. This stage is the longest and the shortest at the same time. Long, because nothing dramatic happens yet. Short, because everything meaningful has already been decided. It is the pause on the edge of consequence, not empty, but fully loaded. Roy felt this in his body before he felt it in his thoughts. A persistent background tension that never escalated into panic because escalation would imply surprise. But there was no surprise left in him. Only readiness without expectation. People often misunderstand inevitability as hopelessness. It is not. Hopelessness collapses action. Inevitability refines it. Roy still acted, still moved, still chose. But his choices no longer scattered outward into uncertain futures. They folded inward, contributing to a narrow band of remaining possibilities. Each decision now felt like a thread laid across a path already drawn. Even his own reflection began to feel unfamiliar, not because he had changed outwardly, but because his internal relationship to time had changed. The future was no longer open territory. It had become a structure approaching completion. In conversations, he noticed how rarely anyone asked him about tomorrow now. People spoke in present terms. Immediate matters, current logistics, short horizons, as though the long arc of his presence had already been mentally resolved. One needed to discuss it. Resolution, when it arrives socially, usually does so without language. Roy no longer searched for openings. He observed closures. He watched opportunities quietly seal themselves without friction. Doors did not slam. They simply stopped opening. Corridors became walls without anyone announcing their construction. This is the phase when navigation changes from exploration to placement, where a person no longer chooses paths, but chooses positions within paths already chosen. Roy adopted that discipline that he controlled posture, he controlled timing, he controlled how much of himself became available to interpretation. Control had shrunk, but what remained of it, he used with precision. He also noticed another change, one that carried a strange calm with it. The intensity of uncertainty that had lived beneath his awareness for so long began to fade. In its place came clarity. Not comfort, not optimism, but clarity. Clarity has no temperature. It is simply sharp. He understood now that his life had entered its last unambiguous phase, not necessarily its last phase in time, but its last phase of unresolved direction. Whatever remained was execution, not evolution. He did not imagine redemption. He did not imagine escape. He did not imagine vindication. That he imagined sequence. And sequence does not require imagination. It only requires patience. Some nights, when the city quieted and his own thoughts finally had space to expand without interruption, Roy reflected on an idea he had once dismissed as sentimental, that at some point, a person stops being who they are becoming and becomes who they have been. He now understood what that meant. The future no longer holds you up as potential. It holds you down as fact. That realization carried no self-pity. It was simply the final stage of identity, when legacy detaches from intention and attaches to record. Roy understood that legacy does not wait for death. It begins assembling itself while you are still alive, often without your consent, often without your awareness. His legacy was now assembling. Independently, the inevitability he felt did not frighten him anymore. Fear requires unpredictability as fuel. What replaced fear was something quieter and heavier. The steady awareness that every remaining moment now existed inside an approaching boundary, not a wall. A threshold. He could sense its proximity without seeing it. That is how inevitability works. It does not rush you. It allows you to walk toward it at your own pace, knowing it will be there when you arrive. Roy no longer resisted that gravitational truth. Resistance would imply that the future might still be negotiated. It could not. The moment had become inevitable not because of a single action, but because of accumulated alignment. And alignment, once complete, does not pause. It proceeds. Chapter 14. The Architecture of the End. The end is never chaos. Chaos is for beginnings, for the first eruption of impulse, for the violent birth of momentum. What comes last is not disorder. It is structure. It is design. It is architecture. Roy DeMeo felt that architecture now as clearly as he once felt power. It existed in the way time had become segmented. No longer a flowing river of days, but a series of contained rooms. Each day now felt framed, entered, occupied, and exited with intention. The future was no longer a horizon. It was a hallway. This is how the end always builds itself. Quietly, with right angles. With permission, nothing rushed anymore. The pace was steady, almost polite. There was no urgency in the atmosphere, because urgency implies uncertainty. The world around Roy no longer felt uncertain. It felt prepared. Roy sensed that preparation in the precision of interaction. When people spoke, they did so with edges sanded down. When places received him, they did so without curiosity. The environment no longer reacted to his presence. It absorbed it. Absorption is a form of decision. It means the environment already knows where you belong. For most of his life, Roy had functioned as a force that disrupted environments. His presence bent rooms, changed trajectories, shifted balances. Now rooms did not bend. They held. The sensation was subtle but unmistakable. The world no longer yielded. Roy began to think in terms of containment, not as imprisonment, but as placement. The question was no longer what would happen to him. It was where he would be placed within what was already unfolding. There is a vast difference between being chased and being positioned. Chasing creates motion. Positioning creates outcome. He had crossed from one to the other. This chapter of a person's life is rarely recognizable while it is happening. There are no markers that say this is the last architecture. It announces itself only through limitation, through the shrinking of optional paths, Through the way every decision now feels less like choice and more like alignment. Roy noticed this alignment everywhere. His routines were no longer interrupted, they were shaped. His access was no longer cut, it was redirected. His relationships were no longer severed, they were sorted. Sorting is never random. What the world was doing now was not reacting to him. It was filing him. And filing is the final phase before closure. Roy had once believed that survival depended on adaptability. That as long as one could pivot faster than pressure, one could outlast almost anything. That belief had been true in an environment defined by volatility. But the environment was no longer volatile. It was calibrated. In a calibrated world, speed no longer saves you. Only placement matters. Roy began to pay attention not to what still moved, but to what had stopped moving around him. The absence of reaction, the absence of escalation, the absence of resistance. These absences were not neutral, they were signs of consensus. Consensus is the final architecture. Once the world agrees, internally, procedurally, structurally, on what something is, it no longer needs to argue with it. It simply acts accordingly. Roy felt that agreement forming around him like the quiet curing of concrete. No sudden hardness, just gradual immovability. The surface still looked normal, but nothing impressed itself into it anymore. Nothing left a mark that he realized with deep clarity that he was no longer being pushed toward an end. He was being built into one. The architecture included many things: time, process, memory, alignment, narrative, documentation. It included everyone and no one. No single figure stood at the center directing it. That is what made it unstoppable. People often imagine endings as confrontations, as final words, as dramatic reckonings. But confrontations require opposing forces of similar scale. What surrounded Roy now was not opposition. It was infrastructure. And infrastructure does not confront. It replaces. Roy adjusted again, not physically, not strategically, but psychologically. He let go of the idea that the end would feel transactional, that there would be a clear exchange, action for reaction, cause for consequence. There would be no exchange, only transition, from active subject to concluded object, from presence to reference, from movement to placement. This is the stage when a man stops asking what he can still do and begins understanding what he will still be. Roy now lived in that understanding, not fearful, not hopeful, precisely aware. The architecture of the end does not rush you. It stands where you are going and waits. Every ending feels like a wall, until you realize it was always a door. Roy DeMeo began to sense that truth in the spaces between things, not in events themselves, but in the way events now connected without resistance. The flow of his life no longer collided with barriers. It aligned with passage. That is how you know the door has been waiting. He had mistaken the narrowing of options for confinement. But confinement implies force. What surrounded him now felt different. It felt like allowance. Like the environment had quietly agreed that he had reached the place where he belonged next, not because of punishment, not because of justice, but because of sequence. Sequence always knows where it is going. Roy felt it in the timing of everything. Conversations happened when they were supposed to. Interruptions arrived with uncanny precision. Delays resolved at the exact moment. Clarity was no longer avoidable. The world was no longer resisting him, but neither was it protecting him. It was transitioning him. A door does not chase you. It simply waits at the place where your path naturally ends. For the first time in a long while, Roy stopped sensing pressure behind him. No pursuit, no tightening coil, no acceleration. What he sensed instead was something far more final: completion. The feeling that the motion that had carried him for years had reached the shape it was always bending toward. This is the danger of doors. You do not fear them the way you fear walls. Walls create conflict. Doors create decision. And decision carries responsibility. Roy began to recognize moments that felt like thresholds, ordinary on the surface, irreversible in meaning. A conversation that ended without invitation for return. A routine that did not need repeating. A familiar place that felt curiously finished. These were not closures imposed from outside. They were internal permissions being revoked. The world was no longer asking whether he would pass through the door. It was acknowledging that his steps were already aligned with it. There is a unique stillness that appears just before transition. The noise of uncertainty fades. The tension of anticipation dissolves. What remains is clarity without comfort, direction without destination, motion without resistance. Roy lived inside that stillness now that he became acutely aware of how much of his life had been spent forcing momentum, creating it, fueling it, sustaining it against friction. Now friction was gone. And without friction, momentum does not need effort. It simply continues until it meets its natural boundary. This is the truth most people never experience consciously. That momentum outlives Roy's will had carried him far. Now what was no longer required. He found no relief in this realization. But he found no panic either. Panic belongs to people who believe they can still turn back. Roy did not believe that anymore. Not because he was trapped, but because returning would require undoing sequence. And sequence does not undo itself. The door had always been there. That was the most unsettling part, that it had not appeared suddenly. It had not been constructed in response to recent events. It had existed quietly at the end of a long path built over years. Every step had led closer to it. Every choice had nudged him in its direction. Even the choices that felt like deviations, especially those. Roy began to sense that the door was not located in a single place. It was not tied to one room, one institution, one moment. It existed simultaneously in multiple forms: procedural, psychological, narrative. Many doors, leading into the same chamber. He did not yet know which one he would cross. He only knew that crossing was no longer optional. What changed now was not his behavior, but his relationship to waiting. Waiting no longer felt like delay. It felt like alignment. Like the final calibration before a threshold accepts what it was built to receive. Roy had always believed that power meant deciding when events would happen. Now he understood that power also meant recognizing when events no longer needed to wait for you. The door does not open dramatically. It opens precisely when the path behind you becomes longer than the space ahead. Roy had reached that ratio. The future had become a narrow strip, the past, an expanding landscape. You cannot walk backward. Through that geometry, you can only pass through what waits forward. And so Roy waited. Not for permission, not for rescue, not for reversal, but for the moment when movement would once again become inevitable. Not pushed, not pulled, but accepted. Thresholds rarely announce themselves. They do not arrive with ceremony, with drama, or with the sharp clarity people imagine when they picture turning points in a life. A true threshold is silent. It reveals itself only after it has already been crossed, when the world on one side no longer feels reachable from the other. Roy DeMeo felt the threshold not as an event, but as a displacement of reality. Things still looked the same. The streets followed their rhythms. Voices carried their usual tones. The routines of daily life continued uninterrupted. But something essential had shifted beneath all of it. An invisible line had been stepped over. He was no longer approaching the end. He was now inside it. The sensation was not fear. Fear belongs to anticipation. This was something subtler and heavier, a psychological reorientation. The awareness that the remaining movement of his life was no longer exploratory. It was transitional. The path ahead did not widen. It narrowed with purpose. Roy began to recognize that the threshold had not been crossed on a specific day or at a specific hour. It had been crossed gradually, through accumulation, through permission surrendered in small pieces, through choices that no longer required debate, through moments that quietly resolved without offering alternatives. Crossing a threshold does not require force. It only requires enough alignment. At this stage, time itself seemed to behave differently. The future felt shorter, not in duration, but in dimension. There were fewer imagined versions of what might come next. Possibility had collapsed into probability. Probability had tightened into sequence, and sequence, once fixed, does not wander. Roy noticed how rarely he now imagined anything far ahead. His thoughts did not extend outward. They moved laterally, within the present. The long-range future had thinned into abstraction. What remained was immediate continuity, day following day, without horizon. This is how transition becomes dominant. People often expect that when the end approaches, awareness becomes sharper, more emotional, more reflective. But for Roy, awareness became quieter, more precise, less crowded by speculation. The mind naturally releases what it can no longer meaningfully influence. Speculation ended. Precision remained. He could feel that the world had already made room for his coming absence, even if it had not yet named it. The systems around him no longer bent to include him. They flowed as if his presence was already becoming optional. This is the final signal of the threshold, not exclusion. Replacement does not feel hostile. It feels neutral. It is the world's way of acknowledging that continuation no longer depends on you. Roy did not experience this as humiliation. He experienced it as an undeniable truth. There comes a moment when a person understands that they are no longer moving with the structure of the world, but being moved by it. That realization produces neither rage nor despair if it is met honestly. It produces recognition. Recognition is calm. Recognition does not argue. Roy no longer searched for leverage. Leverage belongs to beginnings and middle phases, never to endings. By now, he sensed that nothing he could say or do would alter the shape of what had already been assembled. This was not powerlessness, that it was completion of process. Even his sense of identity had subtly detached from ambition and attachment to outcome. He no longer measured himself by what he controlled. He began measuring himself by how clearly he observed the narrowing of control itself. This is the last discipline most people never reach, the discipline of seeing without intervening. Roy lived inside that discipline now. There were no countdowns, no visible clocks, no dramatic signals of arrival. Just the steady knowledge that the threshold had been crossed without sound, and that everything from this point forward would unfold on the other side of it, in no longer a road, a corridor, in no longer a search, a passage. Whatever remained was not about building, expanding, or reshaping. It was about being carried through what had already been built, and that is the most irreversible movement of all. Chapter 15. Part 1. The world without waiting. The world does not pause for endings. That truth became unmistakable to Roy as the days continued unfolding with quiet indifference. Streets filled, doors opened, schedules advanced. The machinery of ordinary life moved forward without signaling that anything meaningful had shifted beneath its surface. This is how endings truly occur, not with interruption, but with continuation. Roy had spent much of his life believing that his presence altered the rhythm of rooms, the tempo of decisions, the direction of motion. And for a long time, that belief had been true. But now the rhythm no longer adjusted around him. It persisted without reference. The world had stopped waiting. Not waiting for him to act. Not waiting for him to decide. Not waiting for him to resolve anything that remained unresolved. Waiting implies uncertainty. Uncertainty had vanished. He sensed this in the way conversations no longer lingered around his presence. People spoke, concluded, and moved on without checking whether he had more to add. This wasn't dismissal. It was normalization, the most final form of removal. When a person is no longer resisted, they often believe they have regained safety. But resistance and relevance are not the same thing. Roy had lost relevance, and relevance, once gone, does not return through effort. It returns only through absence. He watched the environment reorganize itself without drama. New patterns formed where old ones dissolved. Familiar structures adapted quietly. Systems rebalanced in ways that required no acknowledgement of what had preceded them. This is what process completion looks like, not destruction, replacement. Roy felt the subtle erosion of necessity. There were fewer reasons for others to consult him. Fewer moments when his input felt expected. Fewer situations where his presence felt structurally required. That he was no longer central, that he was sequential. This is the stage where a man begins to sense that his life now exists primarily as reference material, a point of origin for systems that no longer need him to function. Even his own memory began to feel externally oriented. He no longer revisited the past as something alive or active. The past became dimensionless, flat, archived, inert. The emotional connection to it loosened. What remained was awareness without attachment. This detachment did not feel like loss. It felt like completion. Roy noticed another subtle shift, the sense that time itself no longer accelerated or slowed around him. It moved with unbroken steadiness. Not rushing, not delaying, just advancing. Time no longer responded to tension. It had become indifferent. Indifference is the final confirmation that the world has moved on internally, even if outward signs have not yet crystallized into formal consequence. Some people mistake this stage for freedom. It is not freedom. Freedom requires openness. This stage requires only passage. Roy moved through days now without resistance from the environment, but also without participation in its direction. He was carried forward by routines shaped elsewhere, by decisions formed beyond his reach, by intentions he could no longer influence. This is what it means to live inside an outcome that has not yet finished unfolding, not trapped, but already assigned. There is a strange calm that settles here, not relief, not peace, but equilibrium. The nervous system, long adapted to pressure, finally recognizes that pressure has completed its work. What remains is not tension. It is implementation. Roy's thoughts grew quieter, not because there was nothing left to consider, but because everything that mattered had already been considered. The calculations were done, the alignments complete, the doors closed. Now, life existed in its simplest form, movement toward what had already been decided. That he no longer asked whether something would happen, he only observed how naturally it continued happening without demand. That is the most unsettling realization of all, that the world does not need permission to continue. It only needs momentum, and momentum, once stabilized, no longer belongs to the one who initiated it. Roy had reached the final psychological landscape before conclusion, the landscape of understood irrelevance, not in the emotional sense, in the structural sense. The point at which the future no longer reflects your intention, only the systems. This was not defeat. It was finality without spectacle. The world no longer waited for Roy DeMeo, and Roy no longer waited for it. When a figure like Roy DeMeo disappears from the world, something strange happens. The noise around his life fades far more slowly than his physical presence ever could. His name stops being spoken out loud, but it continues to travel quietly, through whispered stories, through court transcripts, through men who lived long enough to remember the fear. Power does not vanish when the man is gone. It reshapes itself into memory. Years passed. Decades moved forward. Neighborhoods changed. Old social clubs closed. New generations walked the same Brooklyn streets without knowing what once lived behind certain doors. The city modernized. Cameras replaced lookouts. Phones replaced payphones. The world became faster, louder, more visible. But the shadow of what DeMeo represented never truly left the underworld. His story became caution rather than legend. Efficiency without restraint. Structure without mercy. Power without loyalty. Men who once moved in his orbit aged quickly. Some vanished into obscurity. Some entered witness protection. Some carried the psychological weight of what they had helped build. None escaped it entirely. Because certain experiences harden into the nervous system, they live in reflex, not memory. You don't get over a life like that. You carry it silently, until the body finally decides to stop. Law enforcement, too, evolved from his legacy. Task forces changed tactics. RICO cases expanded. Informants became more protected. Surveillance more advanced. Entire divisions of investigative strategy were reshaped because of what men like DeMeo had once perfected. The system learned, not morally, but structurally. Violence at his scale left fingerprints on policy, not just people. And yet, what haunted those who studied him most wasn't just what he had done. It was how normal everything around him looked while it was happening. That is the truest horror of organized violence. Not chaos, but routine. Not madness, but scheduling. Not rage, but planning. Evil that wakes up on time, pays its bills, shows up to meetings, and returns home quietly at night. The most dangerous monsters are not the loud ones. They're the ones who treat destruction as administration. That is the lesson DeMeo left behind. Not that he was powerful, not that he was feared, not that he was efficient, but that he was ordinary enough to operate invisibly for as long as he did. And invisibility is always the most dangerous weapon. In the end, Roy DeMeo didn't fall in a courtroom, and he didn't disappear into prison silence. His end came quietly, without spectacle, without explanation that could satisfy the scale of his life. There was no public closing statement, no dramatic reckoning, just absence. And absence is the only ending his life could ever have had, because men who spend their lives erasing others rarely leave behind something solid of their own. What remains of him now is not the man, but the pattern, the mechanism, the caution. His story lives on not as a myth to be admired, but as an example of how easily structure can become slaughter when morality is removed from the design. His name appears in books, in indictments, in late-night conversations between detectives and historians who still marvel at the precision and recoil at the cost. Families moved on. Children grew up. Streets were repaved. But somewhere beneath the surface of history, the residue of that violence still exists, embedded in records and scars, and people who learned very early what silence could cost. This is how legacies truly end, not with judgment, not with forgiveness, but with remembrance that refuses to soften. Roy DeMeo is no longer a man moving through rooms. He is a case, a structure, a warning, and the world, indifferent and relentless, continues forward, unshaken by those who once believed they controlled it. You've just listened to the complete journey through the rise, power, collapse, and quiet disappearance of one of the most feared figures in American organized crime history. This was Roy DeMeo, and this was True Crime Records. That if you stayed until the end, thank you for trusting me with your time. That if you're new here, make sure you subscribe, because another story is already waiting for you in the dark. Good night.